In the shadows of royal palaces, behind veils, portraits, and perfectly arranged marriages, lived 30 queens who didn't play by the rules. They seduced empires, shattered norms, and rewrote history with the stroke of a hand or a dagger. Their love lives weren't fairy tales, they were political weapons, scandals in silk. Some ruled with charm, others with chaos. All of them unapologetically unforgettable. This isn't about romance. It's about power and what happens when a queen decides to take exactly what she wants. Welcome to 30 queens who just slept with anyone. And no, you're not ready. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, because this is just the beginning of the royal chaos we uncover here. While you're at it, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manila? 3 a.m. in Texas? We want to know who else is wide awake, listening to royal secrets when they should probably be asleep. Cleopatra the 7th, Egypt. The 7th. She was not beautiful. That's the first thing ancient historians agree on. Not in the way you might expect from someone whose very name became shorthand for irresistible seduction. Her nose was too long, her features sharp, her presence disarming. But Cleopatra didn't need to be beautiful. She was far more dangerous than that. What she had was command, the kind that made men forget they had empires to run. Julius Caesar, for instance, the most powerful man in Rome, a hardened warlord, conqueror of Gaul, and future dictator, was reduced to a stammering tourist the moment he met her. And not in some candlelit boudoir, either. She had herself smuggled into his palace, rolled up in a carpet. Theatrical? Absolutely. Effective? Without a doubt. That night changed the course of Roman history and Egypt's fate with it. And it wasn't just Caesar. After his assassination, she did it again, this time with Mark Antony, a man with a chin carved from ambition and a heart permanently stationed in his lower body. Their affair was the stuff of tabloid prophecy, warships with golden sails, drinking contests that lasted days, a royal love cult that may or may not have been a cleverly disguised military alliance. Cleopatra wasn't sleeping with Rome's elite for sport. She was surviving them and playing them. The court back home wasn't exactly cheering. To the Egyptians, she was a goddess. To the Romans, she was something else entirely. A serpent, a sorceress, a foreign queen with too much influence over our good Roman boys. You know, classic xenophobic slander wrapped in the language of virtue and patriotism. Octavian, who would later become Augustus Caesar, played that card for all it was worth. His propaganda machine painted Cleopatra as a lascivious Eastern temptress corrupting Antony, the good Roman general, into betraying his homeland. The truth? She was smarter than both of them. She just didn't have the military to back it up. It's easy to miss the real scandal here. Cleopatra didn't scandalize the ancient world because she had lovers. She scandalized it because she ruled like a man, but did so as a woman who refused to be domesticated. She didn't marry for alliances. She made alliances through intimacy, yes, but on her own terms. That, for both Rome and later historians, was more threatening than anything she ever did in bed. And what did she want, really? Power? Legacy? Maybe. Or maybe just not to become another puppet queen, another footnote in Rome's increasingly bloody script. She had grown up in a palace full of corpses, siblings who turned on each other, fathers who executed daughters. Love wasn't a language spoken fluently in the Ptolemaic dynasty. Control was. Cleopatra turned that chaos into strategy. She didn't wield her sexuality recklessly. She wielded it like a dagger concealed in silk. And she nearly pulled it off. For a moment, just a moment, there was a real chance that Cleopatra and Antony could unite the eastern half of the Mediterranean, check Roman expansion, and build an empire of their own. But Rome doesn't do sharing, it does conquest. And in the end, Octavian won not because he was more clever, but because he had more legions. When the dust settled, Cleopatra's image was no longer hers. Rome wrote her eulogy, Hollywood added eyeliner, and history turned her into a caricature, the queen who slept her way to power. A neat little moral tale for ambitious women. But the truth is this: Cleopatra didn't sleep with anyone. She chose. Strategically, fiercely, and yes, romantically. She gambled everything on the idea that she could control the empire by seducing its generals, and she almost did. The real question isn't how many men she took to her bed. It's how many of them thought they were the ones in charge. And that brings us to another queen, one who came centuries earlier from a land of gold and incense, and who, according to legend, brought an entire caravan just to meet the wisest man on earth. She didn't need to seduce him, she simply asked questions, but the child she left behind would spark a dynasty and a mystery. Queen of Sheba, Makeda, divided by Bilqis. She arrived with questions. Not troops, not threats, not marriage proposals, but riddles. Gold, spices, camels, loaded with incense. She didn't need an army. Her intellect did the heavy lifting. The Queen of Sheba, known variously as Makeda in Ethiopia and Bilqis in Arabia, made her entrance not as a suitor, but as a challenge. Solomon, king of Israel, famed for his divine wisdom and harem of 700 wives, supposedly met his match in her. And depending on which ancient text you prefer, the Hebrew Bible, the Quran, or the Ethiopian Kebra Nagast, what happened next ranges from diplomatic exchange to spiritual awakening to the kind of ancient world flirtation that ends in dynasties. It's easy to forget how much of her story is wrapped in other men's agendas. Solomon's scribes cast her as a kind of exotic curiosity, a foreign monarch intrigued by his divine glow. Islamic traditions were more generous. She was a ruler in her own right, powerful and respected, even if her story ends with her allegedly converting to Solomon's faith. The Ethiopian tradition, however, flipped the script. There, Makeda wasn't just a queen. She was the founder of the Solomonic dynasty, the bloodline that would eventually include Haile Selassie. She didn't merely visit Solomon. She left pregnant with his child, Menelik. A single encounter, perhaps just one night, became the cornerstone of an entire royal lineage, one that ruled Ethiopia for nearly 3,000 years. That's the thing about Sheba's queen. She occupies this strange space between history and myth, between politics and poetry, and her romantic life, carefully preserved in riddles. Some texts say Solomon tricked her into sleeping with him by legalistic technicalities and shared meals. Others say it was mutual curiosity, a metaphysical mingling of equals. But the result was the same: a son raised far from Jerusalem, who would one day return to steal the Ark of the Covenant, or so the story goes. The mystery here isn't whether she slept with Solomon. It's how that single act, whether myth or memory, justified an empire. Because unlike Cleopatra, whose liaisons were scandalized, the Queen of Sheba's encounter became sacred, a holy origin story, a spiritual justification for centuries of imperial rule. So why the double standard? Perhaps because Makeda's story ends with a child and a throne, not a war and a suicide. She didn't get painted as a seductress, she became a matriarch. The rare woman in ancient narratives who is both desired and revered. Her femininity wasn't framed as a liability, it was holy, prophetic, dynastic. And yet, how much of her story is hers? Sheba, the place itself, remains elusive. Somewhere between Yemen and Ethiopia. Archaeologists still argue over her kingdom's borders. Historians debate whether she ever existed. But that ambiguity is part of her power. She isn't reduced by evidence. She expands in its absence. She haunts scripture, reappears in dreams, and sits at the crossroads of three major religions. We don't know how she ruled. We don't know what she believed. But we know this: wherever she went, she left with the upper hand. Because to arrive in the court of the world's wisest king with riddles is not the act of a supplicant, it's a test. And speaking of tests, the next queen didn't just test her lovers, she made them fight for the honor, quite literally. In a court where survival meant seduction, loyalty meant violence, and love was a blood sport, she turned romance into ritual. A sovereign with a harem of warriors and a throne surrounded by silence. Let's head south to 17th century Angola, where Nzinga was waiting. And if you're still here after that, good. You're exactly the kind of night owl this channel was made for. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next queen who rewrote the rules. And tell us in the comments, where are you tuning in from? And what time is it on your side of the empire? Let's see who else is wandering through history in the middle of the night. Nzinga, Ndongo, and Matamba, Angola. If Cleopatra ruled with seduction and Sheba with mystery, Queen Nzinga of Ndongo and Matamba ruled with terror and flair. And, if legend is to be believed, a revolving cast of doomed lovers who were sometimes required to kill each other before being invited into her bed. Yes, welcome to Angola in the 1,600 seconds, where European colonizers met their match, not in an army, but in a woman with more psychological range than most Renaissance courts combined. Born into chaos, Nzinga came of age during the brutal Portuguese invasion of the Kingdom of Ndongo. Her brother, the king, struggled to hold the territory. Nzinga, meanwhile, was negotiating with the colonizers on his behalf. At one famous diplomatic meeting, she noticed that the Portuguese governor offered her no chair, signaling she was not his equal. So, she calmly ordered one of her servants to kneel and sat on his back. A living throne, a visual metaphor, a permanent scar on colonial arrogance. But diplomacy was only one tool in her arsenal. When her brother died, possibly by her hand, depending on which source you trust, Nzinga seized power, rebranded herself as king, not queen, and made sure no one forgot who was in charge. She led troops into battle. She outmaneuvered the Portuguese. She weaponized alliances. And her personal life? Well, that was a different kind of warfare. According to missionary accounts, and take those with a whole barrel of salt, Nzinga kept a harem of young male concubines, not unusual for monarchs. What made it legendary was the added twist. They were forced to fight each other to the death for the right to spend a single night with her, and afterwards, some say she had them executed to avoid attachments. Others claim it was symbolic, meant to keep her image sacred, her authority unquestioned. Either way, love was not tender in Nzinga's court. It was performance, politics, and power. The point wasn't romance, it was ritual, survival. She had witnessed too many betrayals to believe in fairy tales. Men were useful, temporary, replaceable, and often expendable. Nzinga flipped the script so hard it broke. In a world where women were supposed to be passive prizes, she made herself the judge, jury, and executioner of desire. But like all legends, the edges blur. Some historians say the more salacious elements of her story were colonial propaganda crafted to make her look savage, monstrous, inhuman, And isn't that convenient? A powerful black woman who outwits European generals, humiliates Catholic priests, and rules for 4 decades. Well, surely she must be a man-eating witch queen, right? Or maybe she played the part they feared because it kept her alive. Nzinga didn't want to be remembered as a lover. She wanted to be remembered as a ruler, and She Island Angola still reveres her. Streets bear her name, statues mark her legacy, and yet her myth is still tied to those unnamed men, warriors with no names, no stories, no graves, just bruised echoes beneath a throne. And speaking of thrones, the next queen didn't need brutality to become infamous, just rumors, and a knack for acquiring lovers faster than ministers could take notes. Her name became shorthand for scandal even if most of it wasn't true. Let's head north. To St. Petersburg. To the queen who definitely did not die the way the rumors claimed. Catherine the Great. Russia. They called her a nymphomaniac, a usurper, a foreigner, a tyrant in perils. But Catherine the Great had other titles too. Empress of Russia, enlightened despot, patron of the arts, and the woman who turned a fractured, frozen backwater into one of Europe's great empires. And still, centuries later, what do people remember? A salacious rumor about a horse, one that was never true, never documented, and never forgotten. It's almost impressive how easily a woman's legacy can be boiled down to barnyard gossip. Let's rewind. Born as Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, a minor German princess with a nose for court politics and a mind several sizes too large for her station, she was married off to the Russian heir, Peter III. He was awkward, impulsive, childlike, and famously uninterested in her. Their marriage was about as functional as a broken music box, one that played the wrong song at all the wrong times. Catherine, however, played a longer game. While Peter played with toy soldiers and modelled himself after Prussian kings, Catherine read voraciously philosophy, history, law, Voltaire, Montesquieu. She wasn't preparing to be a good wife. She was preparing to be a better ruler. And in 1762, when Peter finally stumbled into power, he lasted precisely 6 months before Catherine helped remove him in a coup, one that may or may not have ended with his murder. She took the throne not as a consort, but as an empress in her own right. And then she began to rule. The next 3 decades were a balancing act between Enlightenment ideals and imperial expansion. She corresponded with the greatest thinkers of her day, drafted legal reforms, and built schools, hospitals, and museums. She modernized agriculture, championed vaccination, and expanded the empire into Crimea and the Black Sea, but none of that kept her out of the rumor mill. Because Catherine, as it turns out, had a love life, one that was unusually open for a monarch, especially a female one. She had lovers, plural. She appointed them to high office. She rewarded them with estates. Some stayed for years, some for months. It wasn't a secret. It was policy. In her court, intimacy was just another kind of diplomacy. Personal, political, and, yes, sometimes transactional. But let's not confuse clarity with scandal. Catherine wasn't sleeping around. She was choosing selectively, often strategically, and always with her own pleasure and power in mind. Her romantic partners were screened, vetted, and often educated. Some were young and idealistic, others seasoned and sharp. Her last known lover, Platon Zubov, was 40 years her junior and described as beautiful but shallow. Catherine was 60 and perfectly aware. She didn't need deep conversation. She needed loyalty, and she knew how to inspire it. And that's where the problem starts, because history forgives kings their mistresses. Louis XIV had hundreds. Henry VIII killed his wives. Peter the Great flaunted his affairs. But Catherine, a woman who did the same, she became a punchline, a warning, a walking scandal. It was too much for the delicate egos of European diplomats to bear. A woman who enjoyed power and didn't pretend otherwise. A woman who didn't marry for optics or hide her desires in the shadows. So they invented stories to put her in her place. The infamous horse rumor appeared decades after her death, likely created by French pamphleteers with more misogyny than imagination. No evidence, no witnesses. Just a juicy lie that somehow outlived the libraries she built. Why? Because it worked. Even today, mention Catherine the Great, and someone will crack the same tired joke. The irony, of course, is that she'd probably have laughed too, then taxed your estate and expanded your borders. Catherine didn't just defy expectations, she burned them down and built palaces on the ashes. Her rule wasn't flawless. She cracked down on peasant uprisings. She reinforced serfdom. She favored nobility. But within the walls of the Winter Palace, she carved out a private life that didn't ask for forgiveness. And maybe that's the real reason people couldn't look away. She made her bed and her throne the same place. And that brings us to another woman who also toppled a king. But her affair wasn't strategic. It was personal, passionate, treasonous. And when the dust settled, she ruled not as an empress, but as a mother, dragging the crown behind her like a stolen heirloom. A queen who loved hard, betrayed harder, and made England kneel. Queen Isabella of France. They called her the she-wolf of France. Not because she was vicious, though she certainly could be, but because nothing makes the English more uncomfortable than a foreign queen who knows what she wants and doesn't mind tearing apart a kingdom to get it. Isabella of France arrived in England in 1308 as a teenage bride to King Edward II. She was 12 years old, he was 24. Their union was supposed to mend the fragile relationship between England and France. What it became instead was a royal case study in emotional negligence, political backstabbing, and one of the most infamous love affairs in English history. The problem wasn't just Edward, it was who he preferred. From the start, it was clear that Isabella was not her husband's priority. That honour went to Piers Gaveston, Edward's closest companion and rumoured lover. The king lavished gifts on Gaveston, made him Earl of Cornwall, a title usually reserved for royalty, and even paraded him at court with a sense of intimacy that made nobles bristle and bishops flinch. Isabella, the French princess meant to be the Queen of England, was relegated to the sidelines. But she watched, and she waited. After Gaveston was executed by rebellious barons, an act that sent shockwaves through the monarchy, Isabella gained a brief window of influence. Edward, now humiliated and grieving, turned again to a new favourite, Hugh Despencer, the younger. And with him came an entire regime of cruelty. The Despensers tightened control over the royal court, exiled Isabella's supporters, and stripped her of lands and power. She was mocked, sidelined, and politically strangled. This was not a queen in name only. Isabella knew power. She had grown up watching her father, Philip IV of France, manipulate popes and crush the Knights Templar. She understood leverage. So when the opportunity came, she took it. In 1325, Isabella travelled back to France under the guise of diplomacy, accompanied by her teenage son, the future Edward III. There, in exile, she met Roger Mortimer, a disgraced English nobleman turned fugitive who had escaped from the Tower of London in a daring prison break. He was charismatic, angry, and equally fed up with Edward II. Their partnership was political. Until it wasn't. The affair between Isabella and Mortimer became the talk of both courts. In England, it was treasonous. In France, it was quietly thrilling. Here was a queen not mourning her political misfortune, but actively scheming her return with a lover at her side and an army at her back. In 1326, she invaded England. Invaded. A queen. With her son in tow and Mortimer commanding troops, she marched through the country with astonishing ease. Edward II, abandoned by allies and loathed by the public, was captured alongside the Despensers. One was executed, the other tortured. Edward himself was forced to abdicate in favour of his son. Isabella was now effectively regent ruling on behalf of Edward III, who was still a teenager. And Mortimer? He became the de facto ruler of England, living openly with Isabella at court, signing documents, issuing orders. The scandal was total, a foreign queen and her lover running the kingdom. Every sermon, every whisper, every poem was about them. But power borrowed is never power owned. Edward III, upon coming of age, staged his own coup. Mortimer was arrested and executed in 1330. Isabella was spared out of filial mercy, political necessity, or both, and confined to a luxurious retirement. She lived another 28 years in relative peace, painting, reading, and possibly quietly pulling strings from the background. The she-wolf, muzzled but unbroken. So what do we make of her? Isabella's love affair wasn't a footnote. It was the hinge on which a dynasty turned. Without Mortimer, there would be no deposition, no Edward III, no 100 Years' War. Her passion destabilized a crown, rewrote succession, and reminded the English nobility that queens were not to be trifled with. And yet, she too was turned into a cautionary tale. A woman who loved too boldly, ruled too directly, and didn't know her place. She wasn't a seductress, she was a strategist, and when the time came, she chose a lover who matched her ambition not for comfort, but for conquest. Which brings us to another mother, another queen whose personal life was drenched in blood and ambition. One who didn't just play the Game of Thrones, she made sure her son would win it. A snake charmer in the shadow of Alexander, whose myth and mystery still echo through time. Olympia's Macedonia. If you were Alexander the Great, you had two parents. One was King Philip II of Macedon, a war-hardened strategist who unified Greece with a spear in one hand and a bribe in the other. The other was Olympia's priestess, Queen, and arguably the more terrifying of the two. Her presence didn't just cast a shadow across the ancient world, it bled into its very myths. And like many powerful women before and after her, Olympias's reputation was curated by the men she outmaneuvered and often outlived. She was born in Epirus, a minor kingdom with a strong claim to the bloodline of Achilles. That kind of myth mattered. It wasn't just political branding, it was identity. Olympias was raised to see herself as descended from demigods, trained in mystery cults, rituals, and a flavor of power that most Greek women weren't allowed to touch. When she married Philip, it wasn't exactly a love story. It was a strategic alliance, one of many. But she quickly distinguished herself from his other wives. She wasn't content with weaving at the loom or nodding politely at court functions. Olympias had ideas and expectations, and one of those expectations was that her son, Alexander, would inherit the world. She raised him with stories of gods and greatness. According to legend, she told him that Zeus, not Philip, was his real father. The kind of bedtime myth that doesn't fade, especially when you're being groomed to conquer empires. She surrounded him with teachers, warriors, oracles. She gave him not just ambition, but destiny. And when Philip's eye began to wander as it always did, Olympias did not take it quietly. He married a younger woman, a Macedonian noble, which was a political threat to both Olympias and Alexander. Suddenly, their legitimacy wasn't just a personal matter, it was an existential one. Tensions exploded. At one infamous banquet, the groom's uncle toasted to a legitimate heir, implying Alexander wasn't one. Alexander hurled a goblet, stormed out. Olympias followed him into exile. Mother and son, bound by shared pride and shared threat. Then Philip was assassinated, right before Alexander's rise. And the whispers began. Was Olympias involved? No proof. No witnesses, just a suspiciously convenient murder that cleared the path for her son to take the throne. Within days, she began eliminating rivals. Philip's newest wife? Dead. Her child? Dead. Other members of the royal family? Dead or disappeared. Macedonian politics had always been brutal, but Olympias introduced a kind of precision that felt personal. She wasn't ruling from the throne, but make no mistake, she was ruling. Her relationship with Alexander was complex. He left to conquer Persia, and she stayed behind, writing letters, sending advice, keeping a watchful eye on Macedon. She appointed herself political custodian of his legacy. Her letters survive in fragments, always poetic, often barbed. She once told him not to reveal the secrets of their family's divine ancestry, as the knowledge is for kings, not for their servants. Subtle, supportive, controlling. And when Alexander died in Babylon young, undefeated, and without a clear heir, Olympias didn't go quietly into royal widowhood. She stepped forward. She backed her grandson's claim to the throne. She entered the war of succession known as the Diadochi, the bloody scramble among Alexander's generals for control of his empire. Olympias took sides. She allied with those who would protect her grandson. She led armies, issued decrees, executed enemies. At one point, she allegedly arranged the mass killing of 100 enemy soldiers in a single day, men who had once served with her son. A political message written in ancient stone in silence. But time and ambition ran out. Eventually, the tides turned. Her enemies captured her, tried her for treason, and fearing the wrath of her name refused to execute her directly. They handed her over to the families of those she had killed. She died, as many powerful women do in ancient history, at the hands of those who preferred their queens to be ornamental. And yet, Olympias's legacy is impossible to ignore. Was she manipulative? Certainly. Ruthless? Undoubtedly. But she was also something else. A strategist in a game where women were expected to produce heirs and stay out of the way. She did neither. She crafted a king, protected his throne, and tried, for as long as she could, to wield the empire he left behind. Her romantic life, if you could even call it that, was less about affection and more about ambition. Philip may have been her husband, but power was her true partner. She didn't seduce the court. She stared it down until it blinked. And next, we turn to a woman who took the exact opposite path. One whose early life was anything but royal. A woman whose name would rise from the streets of Constantinople and ascend into legend. Because sometimes the Empress isn't born. She's made one whisper, one scandal, one stage at a time. Theodora, Byzantine Empire. In the great gold-plated mosaic of Byzantine history, Theodora shines not because she was polished, but because she wasn't supposed to be there at all. She wasn't born into a dynasty. She didn't come from a house of nobles. She came from the stage. And in 6th century Constantinople, that was less artistic pedigree and more social disqualification. Theodora's early life is wrapped in equal parts myth, moral judgment, and projection. Historians, especially the famously venomous Procopius, love to embellish. In his Secret History, he describes her with a venom usually reserved for defeated enemies and ex-lovers, painting her as scandalous, shameless, and somehow both irresistible and unworthy, which in historical terms usually means powerful women, not sufficiently apologetic. What we do know, she was the daughter of a bear trainer in the Hippodrome, the Byzantine equivalent of a Colosseum meets reality television. Her father died young. Her mother, desperate to support the family, pleaded with the Green faction, the chariot racing team her husband had worked for, to take them in. When they refused, she switched allegiances to the Blues. It was a seemingly small decision. But the Blues were more than a sports team. They were a political faction, one of the two great tribes of the empire, with loyalties that stretched all the way to the palace. In that moment, Theodora's life shifted toward power. She grew up performing, on stage, in the street, possibly in venues where performance and pleasure blurred. Again, records are vague, contradictory, and dripping with either sanctimony or slander. The line between actress and courtesan in Byzantium was drawn by men with ink-stained knives. But Theodora was more than a role. She was a personality, fierce, intelligent, unapologetic. And eventually, she caught the eye of the man who would become Emperor Justinian. Now, here's where things get unprecedented. Justinian wasn't supposed to marry her. Legally, he couldn't. An imperial edict prohibited senators and high-ranking officials from marrying actresses, so he changed the law. Literally. He rewrote imperial code so he could propose to Theodora. This was not a fling. This was a coronation. She became Augusta Empress of the Eastern Roman Empire. And unlike many consorts, she didn't decorate the throne, she shared it. From the moment she entered the palace, Theodora governed. She was not the voice behind the curtain, she was seated at the table, advising, drafting policy, advocating for women's rights, anti-trafficking laws, protections for former performers. She elevated the very people the empire had written off. In doing so, she also rewrote herself. But power does not arrive without backlash. Procopius, whose venom drips from nearly every account of her, accused Theodora of everything from moral degeneracy to political manipulation. He was scandalized by her rise and furious at her influence. His descriptions were less historical and more psychological projection. What happens when a man watches a woman step into a space he thought was reserved for men in robes and sandals? Yet Theodora didn't flinch. During the Nika riots, an uprising that nearly brought down the empire, Justinian was ready to flee. It was Theodora who stopped him. Her speech, allegedly delivered in full imperial regalia, is still quoted. "Purple makes a fine shroud." Translation: better to die an empress than live a coward. They stayed. They crushed the rebellion. She cemented her place in history. So, was her past real? Was she a former courtesan turned empress? A social climber in silk? Possibly. And it didn't matter, because Theodora didn't spend her reign erasing her origins. She used them. She remembered the women left behind, and she legislated for them. She remembered the insults, and she built laws to silence them. She made the imperial court face the fact that greatness does not always wear a crown from birth. Sometimes it comes up from the mud and demands a throne. Her romantic life, condensed by gossip, inflated by men who couldn't imagine that Justinian might have actually loved her. But the truth is simpler and stranger. He did. He trusted her counsel more than his generals. He relied on her judgment more than his bishops. She wasn't a seduction. She was a partner. When she died relatively young, Justinian was never the same. He reigned for years afterward, but reportedly never took another empress. The seat beside him remained empty, as if still occupied by the girl from the hippodrome who once redefined what royalty could look like. And now, we shift from Constantinople's golden mosaics to a quieter chamber in Alexandria. Another queen, another ruler from Egypt. But this one's story is not painted in grandeur. It's brief, tragic, and punctuated by betrayal. Her reign was short, her marriage shorter, and her end came at the hands of the very man who claimed her. Berenice III, Egypt. History tends to overlook the quiet ones, the rulers who didn't leave behind epics or scandalous memoirs, who didn't burn cities or break hearts in diplomatic love triangles. But Berenice III, Queen of Egypt, wasn't forgotten because she was unimportant. She was forgotten because her story ends the moment she finally seizes real power. She was born into the Ptolemaic dynasty, a family so dysfunctional they made Greek tragedy look like a cheerful sitcom. The Ptolemies were infamous for marrying their siblings, poisoning their children, and occasionally mistaking political intrigue for family bonding. Power was not inherited peacefully, it was fought over at the dinner table. Berenice grew up as both a pawn and a potential threat. Her father, Ptolemy IX, was deposed and reinstated multiple times in a whirl of royal family drama so convoluted it makes Shakespeare's plays seem underwritten. But amidst the chaos, Berenice learned to survive. She was educated, poised, and, above all, patient. At first, she was married off, of course, to consolidate power. Her first marriage was to her uncle, her second, possibly to her cousin. The Ptolemies weren't exactly drawing from a wide pool of suitors. These weren't affairs of the heart, they were calculated moves on a family chessboard soaked in paranoia. But Berenice wasn't content to be just another name in a royal contract. By the time she came of age, she was one of the few surviving royals with a legitimate claim to the throne, and remarkably, one of the few with actual support among the Egyptian people. In a kingdom dominated by Greek overlords and native Egyptian resentment, Berenice had an unusual reputation. She was respected, possibly even liked. In 81 BCE, when her father Ptolemy IX died, Berenice ascended to the throne, alone. For the first time in centuries, Egypt had a sole female ruler, not merely serving as regent or consort, but governing outright in her own name. It was a moment of calm in a dynasty defined by chaos. And for a brief, shining moment, it seemed like Egypt might enter a new era, less blood, more stability. But then came the marriage. Enter Ptolemy XI. He was the son of Ptolemy XI, making him Berenice's cousin, or possibly her half-brother. The family tree was less of a tree and more of a tangled vine. Rome, which had started meddling heavily in Egyptian affairs, supported his claim. He was young, ambitious, and, above all, male, which still mattered to both Romans and Alexandrians. A deal was struck. The two would marry and rule jointly. Berenice would retain her legitimacy and experience. Ptolemy XI would add Roman approval and military backing. It lasted 19 days. That's not a metaphor. It's the actual length of their marriage. Shortly after the wedding, barely long enough for the ink on their royal decrees to dry, Ptolemy XI had Berenice murdered. No public trial, no accusations. Just silence and death. The motive? Power. The method? Disputed. But the result was immediate and catastrophic. The Alexandrian populace, who had admired Berenice, erupted. She wasn't just a ruler, she was their queen. The assassination wasn't just a betrayal, it was an insult. the city revolted. And in a rare moment of historical justice, Ptolemy XI was hunted down by a mob and lynched in public. His reign, if you can even call it that, ended the way it began, violently, clumsily, and unceremoniously. And then, nothing. Berenice vanished from the narrative. Her reign, however brief, was erased from many official records. No temples, no statues, just fragments. A name here, a mention there. The Ptolemaic dynasty, always obsessed with its own myth, quietly swept her aside in favor of the next ruler. Power moved on. Memory did not. So what does Berenice's story tell us? Not every queen's romantic history is salacious or legendary. Sometimes it's just tragic. Sometimes the act of loving or simply trusting the wrong man is enough to end a dynasty. Berenice wasn't devoured by scandal. She was extinguished by politics. She didn't sleep her way to the top. She was already at the top, and that's why she was removed. Her love story wasn't passionate or storied. It was efficient, cold, fatal. And now, from the temples of Egypt to the pagodas of Pagan, we follow the thread of queens whose lives were not their own. The next woman didn't just fall in love with one king, she fell into the arms of three. Successively, maybe accidentally, maybe fatefully, a queen passed from throne to throne, until history could no longer tell where her heart ended and empire began. Manisanda of Burma, Myanmar. If history had a sense of irony, and it does, then Manisanda of Pagan might be its quietest punchline. She wasn't a conqueror, she wasn't a seductress, she wasn't even technically a queen at first. She was just the daughter of a provincial governor, married off for diplomatic convenience, a name on a scroll, a signature to smooth out political borders. And yet, somehow, without waging war or writing poetry, she would become the woman three successive Burmese kings could not stop loving and could not keep. The story begins in the 11th century, in a time when Pagan, soon to be the first Burmese empire, was still a patchwork of city-states and shifting allegiances. Manisanda, the daughter of the governor of Pegu, was sent north to marry King Anarata, the powerful unifier of Burma. This was not about affection. It was diplomacy. Marrying a woman from Pegu meant peace with Pegu, and Anarata was not the sort of man who left loose ends on the map. So Manisanda arrived at court, young, dutiful, and entirely under the shadow of a man who saw marriage as a form of conquest. Anarata was already a living legend, carving temples and law codes into the soil of a nation still being invented. But their union was not long. Whether the king grew indifferent or fate intervened, Manisanda never quite settled into her role as queen. Because then came Prince Saul Lu. Saul Lu was Anarata's son, restless, romantic, and unburdened by his father's iron discipline. According to court historians, he fell for Manisanda almost immediately. Depending on who you ask, she either returned his affection or merely tolerated it. Either way, once Anarata died, Saul Lu did something that would make any historian, strategist, or step-family therapist wince. He married his stepmother. Yes, that happened. In modern terms, it would be considered eyebrow-raising. In royal terms, it was catastrophic. The marriage alienated his court, confused his allies, and blurred the lines of succession. Manisanda, once queen to the father, became queen to the son. And with that, the tension began. Saul Lu was nothing like his father, less focused, more impulsive. His reign was marked by indecision, palace intrigue, and a deepening reliance on a childhood friend turned general, Kyansitha. Now, here's where the triangle becomes a square. Khaensitha was the ideal Burmese hero, brave, loyal, and with a tragic glint in his eye. He had fought beside Anarata. He had earned glory on the battlefield. And, of course, he fell in love with Manisanda too. Their connection, at least in legend, was quiet but profound. Unlike the other two kings, Khaensitha didn't claim her. He protected her. From the sidelines, from the shadows, until it was too obvious. Saulu discovered the emotional bond real, or suspected, between his wife and his best friend, and in a move that should surprise no one, he exiled Khaensitha from the court. The general wandered, vanished, disappeared into obscurity, while Saulu clung to both the throne and a wife whose affections, it seemed, had started drifting. And then Saulu died, killed in rebellion, betrayed by the very governor he had trusted. Manisanda, once again, was a widow. Again, the throne was empty. Again, the kingdom needed stability. So guess who came back? Khaensitha returned not as a lovesick general, but as a king. He crushed the rebellion, restored order, and took the throne as Pagan's third great monarch. And then, finally, after years of silence and separation, he married Manisanda. Third time's the charm. 3 kings, 1 queen, 1 lifetime. Was it love? Probably. Was it power? Certainly. Was it strategy? Inevitably. But the strange thing about Manisanda's story is that she doesn't appear to do very much, and yet she changes everything. She moves from one king to another, not as a manipulator, not as a seductress, but as a constant, a living thread between generations of rulers. Every time the throne shakes, she's still standing. Not ruling, exactly, but reigning in a way no title ever captures. Historians struggle with her. There are no declarations from her, no manifestos, no records of grand speeches or decrees, but she is written into every reign she touched. She outlasted wars, outlived kings, and survived being both prize and liability. Her power was soft, elusive, impossible to categorize, which may be why it worked. She wasn't a queen in the way stories like to frame queens, scheming, tragic, or scandalous. She was something more difficult to define, and perhaps more dangerous. Because she didn't need to control the kingdom to shape its fate. And from the lush courts of Pagan, we now follow another warrior woman, one who made marriage a literal battle, who turned would-be husbands into training partners, and who refused every man who couldn't pin her to the ground. In the steppes of Central Asia, love was a contact sport. Kutulun, Mongolia, divided by Central Asia. If Manisanda drifted like silk between the thrones of Burma, Kutulun thundered into history on horseback, draped in armor and defiance. Her court was the open steppe, her scepter a bow, and her love life? A contact sport, literally. Because in order to marry Kutulun, you had to beat her in a wrestling match. And nobody could. Born in the 1260 seconds into the royal bloodline of the Mongol Empire, Kutulun was the great-great-granddaughter of none other than Genghis Khan himself. Her father, Kaidu, ruled a large swath of Central Asia and resisted the authority of Kublai Khan, his more famous cousin. Their family was part of the Ögedei line, a splinter faction of the once mighty Mongol Empire, now fractured into competing khanates. It was a brutal time for diplomacy and an even worse time for soft-hearted princesses, which worked out fine because Kutulun had no intention of playing one. From a young age, she trained alongside her brothers in the warrior arts, archery, horseback riding, and wrestling, the traditional Mongol triad of masculine excellence. Kutulun didn't just keep up, she surpassed them. She reportedly fought in battles at her father's side, rode fearlessly into enemy lines, and tore down any assumption that women belonged behind tents. The Mongols revered strength, and Kutulun had plenty. What they weren't used to was that strength coming from a woman who demanded the same respect as any man. And then came the challenge. Kutulun declared that she would only marry a man who could defeat her in wrestling. The stakes? High. Every man who failed had to forfeit 100 horses. You'd think the humiliation of public defeat was bad enough. Imagine walking away while your bride to not be parades off with your herd. According to Marco Polo, yes, that Marco Polo, Kutulun amassed 10,000 horses this way. It's likely an exaggeration, but the symbolic truth is clear. She wasn't just winning, she was dominating. These weren't ceremonial matches. They were real physical contests in front of crowds. Each bout another public reminder that she couldn't be claimed, only respected. And that proved problematic. See, Kaido, her father, adored her. He reportedly wanted her to succeed him as Khan, an unprecedented move, but Mongol nobility balked at the idea. A woman? As ruler? Even with her battlefield record and bloodline, it was too radical. Her refusal to marry despite endless offers made it worse. Without a husband, she had no male ally to anchor her power in tradition. Without a son, she had no heir to sell to the council. And yet, she held the line. Eventually, sources suggest, she did marry, perhaps to a trusted general, perhaps to a man she actually loved. Some say it was Ghazan, the ruler of Persia, though historians widely doubt this. Her marriage, whenever it happened, seems to have ended the public wrestling challenges. But even then, she didn't disappear into domesticity. She continued fighting in her father's campaigns, and when Kaido died, she reportedly fought her brothers for succession. She lost. Not in war on paper, she was more qualified than any of her male siblings, but in the court of tribal politics. Her gender, as always, was the stumbling block. She was simply too much of a contradiction. A woman shaped like a king, moving like a general, refusing the script written for her. And that's where Kutulun's story becomes murky. Some say she died young. Others say she lived into old age, mentoring future queens and warriors. What's certain is that after her death, her name faded from the Mongol chronicles. She wasn't erased completely, but she was folded into legend. Her real power diluted by time, her image recycled into myth. Centuries later, her story would inspire elements of Turandot, the opera by Puccini, except in Turandot, the princess's refusal to marry is painted as icy, cruel, something to be tamed by the right man. A misunderstanding of Kutulun's ethos entirely. She didn't reject marriage because she hated men. She rejected submission. She made love and war the same challenge. If you wanted her, you had to earn her. Not with flattery, not with wealth, with strength. And no one ever did. Now, from the wild expanse of Central Asia, we pivot sharply east of Eden into the ancient stone carvings and high palaces of Assyria, where another queen awaits. Not a warrior, not a wrestler, but something stranger. A woman whose legacy exists almost entirely in myth. She didn't fight on battlefields. She lingered in legends. She didn't rule with horses or husbands, but with echoes. Shamuramat Semiramis Assyria. There are queens who ruled. There are queens who conquered. And then there's Shamuramat, better known by her mythologized name. Semiramis, a queen who may have done both, or neither, depending on who you ask. She exists in that delicate historical purgatory where fact and legend blur into one another until the figure becomes a silhouette painted with contradictions. Here's what we do know. Shamuramat was a real historical figure. She lived during the 9th century BCE and was the wife of Shamshi-Adad-V, king of Assyria, an empire known less for its romantic storytelling and more for its habit of grinding neighboring civilizations into dust. After her husband's death, Shamaramat assumed an unprecedented role. She didn't merely mourn, she ruled. Her son, Adad-Nirari III, was still too young to govern. So Shamaramat stepped in not as a silent regent hiding behind court officials, but as a sovereign in all but name. For 5 years, her name appeared beside her son's in royal inscriptions. She issued edicts. She may have led military campaigns. She commissioned temples and public works. In a brutal, patriarchal empire where queens were expected to fade into ceremonial roles, Shamuramat wrote herself into stone. And then, silence. After her son came of age, her name vanishes from official records. Not unusual, perhaps, but telling. Assyrian historians weren't known for generosity when it came to powerful women. The narrative simply moves on. Until, centuries later, the Greeks pick up her story and turn her into something else entirely. Enter Semiramis. In the classical imagination, Shamaramat morphs into a near-mythical queen of impossible achievements. According to Herodotus, Diodorus, and other ancient writers, Semiramis didn't just govern Assyria, she built it. She allegedly founded Babylon, constructed its legendary hanging gardens, and led military campaigns as far as India. She was said to have conquered Libya, Egypt, and Ethiopia. She built cities, carved mountains, and slept with kings before killing them. And if that sounds familiar, it should. It's the standard script for how ancient male writers dealt with women they didn't quite know what to do with. Make them legends. Then accuse them of excess. What's striking is how far the myth diverges from the likely truth. The real Shamuramat was a regent queen, operating within the constraints of Assyrian law and court politics. She navigated power through stability, not spectacle. The myth of Semiramis, on the other hand, turned her into a cautionary tale. Too powerful, too sensual, too ambitious. She became the archetype of the dangerous Eastern queen, the forerunner to Cleopatra, Catherine, and every woman history couldn't quite domesticate. Why? Because power in the hands of a woman, especially in antiquity, had to be explained, or condemned, or turned into metaphor. And the easiest way to do that was to make her a monster of ambition, someone whose love life was as exaggerated as her military record. Semiramis, in the Greek version, was said to seduce her generals, disguise herself as a man to go to war, and even marry her own son before being struck down by the gods. It's not a biography, it's a fever dream of ancient male anxiety. And yet, the myth endured. Roman poets referenced her. Medieval chroniclers rehashed her. Renaissance painters immortalized her. In each version, she was slightly different: warrior queen, enchantress, builder, tyrant, but always the same archetype. A woman who stepped beyond the bounds of acceptable femininity and dared to claim a crown for herself. Her love life, like her rule, is more fiction than record. There's no real evidence that she slept with anyone to gain power, as later myths suggest, but the implication sticks. A woman that powerful must have used seduction, because what else could explain her rise? Competence, intelligence, strategy? Those aren't tidy answers. So what's left of Shamuramat beneath the legend of Semiramis? A woman who for 5 years held together one of the most militarized empires in history. A queen who operated in the shadows of palaces, temples, and patriarchs, and yet carved her name into the oldest stone we have. A figure whose real power was so threatening The only way to make sense of it was to mythologize it. And maybe that's the point. Sometimes, history buries powerful women under layers of scandal and storytelling, not to celebrate them, but to contain them. And in doing so, it reveals more about the fears of the writers than the women they write about. Next, we pivot to another queen from the same continent, one whose romantic legend also made its way into myth, only this time from a very different direction. Her rule was brutal, revered, and deeply misunderstood. And she didn't just make kings kneel, she made them die trying. Nyinga Angola divided by Africa. If you're looking for a queen who defied empires, burned treaties, and redefined royalty while standing barefoot on a battlefield, then prepare yourself for Queen Njinga of Ndongo and Matamba. She didn't just rule kingdoms, she warred with empires. She didn't just defy conventions, she broke them, bent them, and then made them kiss her feet. And somewhere in the storm of power politics, guerrilla warfare, and colonial resistance was her bedroom, a battlefield of its own. Nyinga, also spelled Nzinga, was born in 1583 into the royal family of the Kingdom of Ndongo in what is now modern-day Angola. She came of age at the dawn of European colonization when the Portuguese were spreading across the African coast like wildfire, demanding conversions, land, and slaves. For African kingdoms, it was a moment of either submission or survival. Nyinga chose survival, and then she turned it into strategy. When her brother, Ngola Mbande, became king, he inherited a kingdom on the brink plagued by slave raids, internal rebellions, and a Portuguese colonial force hungry for new territory. Njinga quickly became his emissary, diplomat, and enforcer. In 1622, she was sent to negotiate with the Portuguese governor in Luanda. The story of what happened at that meeting has become legend. Upon arrival, she found no chair had been provided for her, a subtle power play she was expected to stand, while the governor sat, signaling her inferiority. Njinga didn't flinch. She motioned to one of her attendants, who immediately dropped to their knees and offered their back as a human seat. She sat, eye level with her adversary. She wasn't there to plead. She was there to negotiate as an equal. And she did. The meeting ended in a temporary peace treaty. She even agreed to be baptized, a political move, not a spiritual one, and took the name Ana de Souza after the governor's wife. That same year, she returned home. By the next, her brother was dead. The cause? Officially suicide. Unofficially? Unclear. But what was clear was that Njinga seized the throne. Her claim wasn't without controversy. She was a woman in a patriarchal society. Her rivals accused her of witchcraft, betrayal, and arrogance. But Njinga, ever the tactician, silenced them with two weapons: violence and charisma. She restructured her military. She built alliances with displaced peoples. And most notably, she took the unthinkable step of declaring herself king. Not queen, styling herself as Ngola Njinga, sovereign ruler, with no male authority above or beside her. And then came the Portuguese. For the next 4 decades, Njinga waged a relentless campaign against colonial forces. Her warfare was asymmetric, brutal, and deeply intelligent. She used the terrain to her advantage, led troops personally, and shifted alliances like a grandmaster moving chess pieces. When Portugal allied with rival tribes, she turned enemies into informants. When her army faltered, she regrouped and retaliated. She didn't just fight with her people, she fought as them. But Nyinga's story isn't just military, it's personal. Her court became infamous not just for its political intrigue, but for its unconventional structure. According to European missionary accounts, always suspicious, often exaggerated, Njinga kept a harem of young male concubines, referred to as her wives. Some say they dressed as women. Some say they fought to the death for her attention. Others say the entire story was colonial slander, designed to depict her as deviant and savage. But, whether exaggerated or not, Njinga's personal life became symbolic of something larger, a deliberate rejection of European expectations. She refused to play the part of the pious Christian queen. She worshipped ancestral spirits, conducted rituals, and ruled her body as fiercely as she ruled her empire. In a world where submission was expected, Njinga's autonomy was more radical than her armies. Even her enemies feared her. The Portuguese referred to her as a Rainha Ginga, Queen Njinga, with a mix of awe and exasperation. Missionaries tried to convert her. Generals tried to capture her. None succeeded. She outlived them all. When she finally signed a peace treaty in her 70s, it wasn't out of weakness, it was out of strategy. Her people were exhausted. Her territories needed rebuilding. So she laid down the sword and picked up diplomacy again. Until her death in 1663, she ruled Matamba not as a broken rebel, but as a sovereign. A queen, a king, a general, a ghost that haunted colonial ambitions. And what of love? If Njinga loved anyone, it was her kingdom. Her consorts were footnotes. Her true intimacy was with power malleable, unpredictable, fiercely defended. She was not a lover in the classical sense. She was a sovereign who redefined intimacy as sovereignty over her own choices, her own body, her own bloodline. And so, from the jungles of Angola, we pivot back to Constantinople, where another woman named Theodora waits in the wings. But this one isn't standing in the theatre spotlight. She's standing in the echoes of the first Theodora, centuries later, trying to climb the same imperial ladder, only to find it greased with history, scandal, and the slippery slope of reputation. Empress Theodora, revisited for her background. When a name resurfaces in history, it's rarely by accident. And when the name is Theodora again, you can be sure that someone, somewhere, was either trying to invoke power, escape a past, or rewrite a legacy. The first Theodora, the performer turned empress, left a shadow so large it stretched across centuries. This second Theodora, she stepped into that shadow. And just like her namesake, she refused to stay quiet. This Theodora lived during the Byzantine Empire's later period, roughly in the 9th century, by which time the empire had traded its swords for icons and its chaos for bureaucracy. The politics of this age weren't fought in chariot riots or lavish orgies, but in monasteries, treaties, and behind the veils of imperial etiquette. Still, under the silks and psalms, the game remained the same. Who gets to rule, and who gets to watch? Theodora came to prominence as the wife of Emperor Theophilos, a ruler best remembered for his zealous enforcement of iconoclasm, the religious movement that banned the veneration of images. It was the theological firestorm of its day. Icons weren't just art, they were political statements, declarations of faith, and sometimes subtle power grabs. And in that firestorm, Theodora played a strange role. Publicly, she obeyed. She hid her personal devotion to icons, played the loyal wife, and stood beside her husband as he cracked down on monasteries and monks. But privately, she was waiting, watching, holding on to her own beliefs in silence. Because, even in a palace covered in gold, belief, true belief, was a dangerous thing. Then Theophilos died. Suddenly, at 29, leaving behind 5 daughters, a young son, and a power vacuum the size of Constantinople itself. And Theodora stepped forward, not as dowager, not as ornament, but as regent. She immediately reversed her husband's iconoclastic policies, restoring the veneration of images, inviting back exiled monks, and re-establishing ties with the Orthodox clergy. She did what her husband never could, stabilize the empire through faith, not force. And in doing so, she sparked what the Church would later call the triumph of orthodoxy, a religious victory, but also a political one. For nearly 15 years, Theodora ruled as regent for her son, Michael III, and for a time, the empire was calm. Bureaucrats feared her, nobles respected her, and clerics thanked her. She maintained a tight court, advanced public works, and pushed back against the encroaching Arab powers in the east. She was a competent, capable administrator, not flashy, not scandalous. But in Byzantine terms, that was scandalous because she refused to be invisible. And then came the unraveling. As Michael grew older, he grew impatient. He didn't want to be the boy king ruled by his mother's hand. He wanted to drink, race horses, and install his own favourites in court. He fell under the influence of his uncle Bardas, a man who despised Theodora's control and who knew exactly how to whisper poison into a young emperor's ear. Theodora was pushed aside. Not violently, not publicly, but methodically. First, her advisors were dismissed. Then, her ceremonial appearances reduced. Eventually, she was exiled to a monastery under the guise of religious retirement. In other words, the imperial equivalent of being sent to a very luxurious, very inescapable prison. And that's where history began to forget her. No public scandal, no great betrayal, no riot or rebellion, just silence. Except, her story didn't really end there. Because what's more subversive than a woman who plays the long game not with lovers or weapons, but with patience? Theodora didn't seduce her way into power. She waited for it. She used marriage to gain entry, motherhood to maintain influence, and religion to secure legitimacy. Her romantic history, if it even deserves that term, was dry by royal standards. No famous affairs. No war brides. No bloody love triangles. But perhaps that's exactly what made her so dangerous. She was a queen who kept her emotions off stage and her strategies behind locked doors. She ruled quietly, surgically, and often without applause. And in a court that expected women to be either saints or sinners, Theodora refused both roles. She was something much harder to narrate, competent, which, in a way, is the deepest threat of all. A woman who doesn't scandalize because of sex, but because she governs better than the men around her. From the hushed chambers of Byzantium, we now step into something more ambiguous, half legend, half spectacle. A woman remembered not for what she did, but for what she didn't wear. Her name conjures nudity on horseback and whispers of rebellion. Maybe none of it happened, maybe all of it did. But the name Lady Godiva still rides, hair flowing, eyes forward, wrapped in myth and question marks. Lady Godiva. She's the naked lady on a horse. That's the image, isn't it? That's the only thing most people know about her. A woman riding through the streets of medieval England, with her hair flowing down her back, no clothes, no shame, no sound, but the clip-clop of hooves on cobblestones, and the breathless silence of townspeople with their windows shut. Or open. Depends on which version you've heard. The story of Lady Godiva isn't one of royal coronations or warlike declarations. It's not even clear whether she was technically a queen. But she's become one in cultural memory, a monarch of protest, of symbolism, of contradiction. A woman who supposedly stripped down to make a point, and in doing so, became immortal. But let's step back for a second. Historically speaking, Lady Godiva, or Godgifu, in Old English was a real person. She was the wife of Leofric, the powerful Earl of Mercia, one of the most influential noblemen in 11th century Anglo-Saxon England. The Domesday Book confirms her landholdings. Various charters record her donations to religious houses. She was pious, politically active, and wealthy in her own right. By all accounts, she was respected. A land-owning noblewoman in a world where women rarely got their names in ink. No horses, no nudity, no dramatic gestures. At least, not yet. The famous legend doesn't show up until nearly 2 centuries after her death. According to 13th century chronicler Roger of Wendover, Lady Godiva pleaded with her husband to reduce the heavy taxes he'd imposed on the people of Coventry. Leofric, possibly bored or possibly cruel, agreed on one condition: that she ride naked through the town. Whether this was meant as a joke, a dare, or a test, the implication was clear. She wouldn't do it. No noblewoman would. But she did. According to the legend, she ordered the townspeople to stay indoors, shut their shutters, and look away. Out of respect, out of solidarity, out of awe. Only one man, later dubbed Peeping Tom, disobeyed. He peeked, and depending on the version, he was struck blind, dead, or just labelled as the origin story of every nosy neighbour in history. But here's the problem. There's no record of this story before the 1200 seconds, and by then, Godiva had been dead for more than 100 years. The real Godiva, as far as we can tell, was a wealthy widow who continued to own land and influence church decisions long after her husband's death. She endowed monasteries. She likely never rode anywhere unclothed. So why did the legend appear? Because it's irresistible. The image of a noblewoman laying down her dignity to stand up for the poor was radical, subversive, unthinkable, and therefore unforgettable. But even more unsettling is the way the legend is told. The act stripping naked was supposed to be humiliating, but the result? Reverence. The townspeople don't jeer or scorn her. They turn away. They obey. She reclaims her vulnerability and uses it as power. That's the real twist. In a world where women's bodies were almost always used against them, objectified, controlled, commodified, Lady Godiva's myth flips the script. She weaponizes modesty by refusing it. Of course, the men who wrote this story didn't see it that way. They added Peeping Tom, because even in a story about a woman's sacrifice, the male gaze must find its way in. The story couldn't survive without that one eye, that one stare. He exists not just to disobey, but to remind us what was at stake. And yet, the legend endured. Artists painted her, poets praised her, cities built statues of her. In Victorian England, she was repackaged as a symbol of virtue, her nudity sanitized, turned into an allegory of purity. In modern pop culture, she became something else again. A feminist icon, a rebel, a contradiction. Did she ride naked? Almost certainly not. Did she speak up for the poor? Possibly. But in the end, Lady Godiva exists not because of what she did, but because of what she made people believe she did, and that's a kind of power no crown can guarantee. She became unforgettable by doing the thing queens are never supposed to do. She exposed herself, and everyone else had to look away. Next, we ride back across the desert sands toward the temples of Karnak and into the life of another woman whose legend is written not in soft protest but in stone, a queen who ruled Egypt like a pharaoh, who wore the beard of a god, the crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, and whose romantic history if you ask certain scholars, still makes them squirm. Hatshepsut, Egypt. There's something unnerving about a woman in a beard, especially when that beard is made of gold, fastened to her chin with ceremony, and worn not for disguise but for dominance. Hatshepsut didn't just rule Egypt. She redefined what it meant to do so. Not as queen, not as consort, but as pharaoh. The title reserved for gods on earth. She didn't marry into power, she embodied it. And that, apparently, was unacceptable. Let's start with the basics. Hatshepsut was born around 1507 BCE into the 18th dynasty, one of Egypt's most powerful royal lineages. Her father, Thutmose I, was a strong military ruler. Her mother, Ahmose, was a powerful queen in her own right, and from an early age Hatshepsut was groomed not for the throne, but for the periphery of it. Like most royal daughters, her job was to decorate the palace and marry the right cousin. And she did. She married her half-brother, Thutmose II. Not unusual, not romantic, just strategic. Together, they ruled briefly, though evidence suggests she was the more capable half of the arrangement. When Thutmose II died young, the throne passed to his son by a lesser wife, Thutmose III. A toddler at best, a symbol, a placeholder. And that's when Hatshepsut made her move. First, she declared herself regent, standard protocol. Then, she built alliances, priests, architects, scribes, and bureaucrats who owed their livelihoods to her court. And then, quietly, but unmistakably, she stopped standing behind the throne. She sat on it. Within a few years, she had been crowned pharaoh in a full coronation ceremony. She took on the full royal titulary, including the Horus name, the two ladies' name, and the throne name, Ma'at-Kare, truth is the soul of the sun god. She didn't claim to be queen. She claimed to be the living god, the divine intermediary between Egypt and the heavens. And then, she put on the beard. Symbolic, of course. The false beard was a ceremonial fixture of pharaohs, but on Hatshepsut, it was more than costume. It was confrontation. A woman, dressed in the visual language of male authority, not to pass as a man, but to redefine what a ruler could be. So naturally, centuries of historians have been asking the same question. Why? And more specifically, who was she in love with? Because heaven forbid a woman ascend to absolute power without a romantic motive. The most persistent theory centers around Senenmut, a commoner turned court official who rose rapidly through Hatshepsut's ranks. He was her steward, her architect, her advisor. He was given unprecedented honors, his name carved into temples, his statue placed near hers, his tomb located disturbingly close to hers. Some of the more enthusiastic archaeologists even point to a bit of graffiti found in a remote tomb, depicting a woman in pharaonic regalia being intimately admired by a man presumed to be Senenmut. Scandalous? Sure. Conclusive? Not even remotely. The truth is, we don't know. We have no letters, no poetry, no confessions scratched into limestone, just proximity, power, and silence. The kind of silence that fills a temple when the statue of a god is carried through it. If there was love, it was private. If there was a scandal, it never left the walls. If Senenmut and Hatshepsut were lovers, they were also co-conspirators in something far more dangerous, a queen who dared to rule as a god-king, and a man who helped her get there. But perhaps the obsession with her love life is just a misdirection. Because Hatshepsut's true legacy isn't her romance, it's her architecture. She didn't wage wars, she built monuments, temples, obelisks. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri still stands today, carved into the cliffs, glowing at sunrise like the face of a god. She commissioned expeditions to the land of Punt, bringing back incense, exotic animals, and myrrh trees, yes, actual trees that she had planted in her temple gardens. Trade flourished. The arts soared. Egypt basked in one of its most stable, prosperous periods. And then she vanished. Not in life she ruled for over 20 years, but in history. After her death, someone tried to erase her. Her images were defaced. Her cartouches were chiseled out. Her statues were smashed or buried. The official records rebranded her reign as an inconvenient hiccup between real kings. Why? Some blame Thutmose III, the once infant heir who eventually reclaimed the throne. Others blame the priests, the bureaucracy, the story. A woman had ruled, successfully, as a man, and the system couldn't absorb it. So her story was buried literally, and centuries later it was excavated, dusted off, and questioned. Was she really that powerful? Was she really that independent? Surely there was a man behind it all? Surely. And now, from the sands of Egypt, we cross into the forbidden court of the only woman in Chinese history to wear the yellow robe and sit on the dragon throne. A former concubine turned empress, turned emperor, turned legend. And her rise was as subtle as a knife in the dark. Empress Wu Zetian. In imperial China, the throne was a sacred thing built not only of jade and gold, but of rigid expectations. It was reserved for the son of heaven, not the daughter, for men, not women. At best, an empress could rule behind a silk screen, whispering orders into her husband's ear. At worst, she could be banished, silenced, or quietly poisoned. And then along came Wu Zetian. She didn't just whisper behind the throne, she sat on it, alone, in full imperial regalia. She didn't rule as empress consort, or even as empress dowager. She ruled as emperor. The only woman in 3,000 years of dynastic Chinese history to do so in her own name. And for that, she has been called every name in the book. Ambitious, dangerous, poisonous, seductive, never just capable. Wu Zetian was born in 624 CE to a relatively well-off but non-noble family. She was educated rare for girls in the Tang dynasty and trained in literature, music, politics. At 14, she entered the court of Emperor Taizong as a concubine. Not even high-ranking, more or less just one name among many, in a system where women were measured in proximity to male attention. When Taizong died, custom dictated that all his concubines who hadn't borne sons be sent to a Buddhist convent. Wu followed the rules temporarily. But she had already caught the eye of Taizong's son, the new Emperor Gaozong. So she left the convent, some say with help, and re-entered the palace this time as his concubine. You may already be sensing a theme. Wu Zetian didn't break rules by storming through them. She bent them until they forgot their original shape. She didn't demand power. She accepted it when others thought she couldn't take it. She positioned herself so precisely that when her rivals tried to strike, they missed and hit each other instead. Her early years in court were bloody. She was accused of manipulating Gaozong into dismissing his first wife. She was rumored to have eliminated rivals, including one particularly persistent rumor that she murdered her own infant daughter to frame the empress. The story has been repeated endlessly, though never proven. But it doesn't matter. History clings harder to accusations than to facts, especially when a woman rises too far. Once empress, Wu didn't stop. When Gaozong suffered a series of strokes, she became the de facto ruler, issuing edicts in his name, then in her own. When he died, she bypassed the traditional regency model and installed herself as the true sovereign, not behind the curtain, in front of it. She founded her own dynasty, the Zhou dynasty, interrupting the Tang for 15 years. She took the title Huangdi, a title previously reserved for male emperors. She adopted all the symbols of divine authority: the jade seal, the dragon robe, the mandate of heaven. And she ruled. Not as a placeholder, not as a figurehead, as a reformer. She expanded the imperial examination system, which allowed people from lower social classes to join the bureaucracy based on merit. She restructured the court to dilute the power of entrenched noble families. She championed agriculture, cut taxes, and invested in public works. She even elevated the status of women's education subtly but symbolically. But none of that kept her name clean. She was portrayed as a femme fatale, a manipulator, a schemer. Chinese historians, mostly men, wrote of her cruelty, her ruthlessness, her supposed sexual appetites. That last part is particularly sticky. Wu Zetian, they claimed, kept a rotating cadre of young lovers in a secret palace imported from across the empire to serve her personal whims. Sound familiar? A woman in power must be explained. And desire is always the easiest explanation. It reduces strategy to seduction. It turns governance into gossip. The stories persist. She used men for pleasure and then discarded them. She ruled through lust, not law. And yet, beneath the myth, there is still a throne. Still policies, still temples and reforms and economic records that show she did exactly what male emperors did, only better and with more obstacles. She reigned for over 4 decades. She was in her 80s when she was finally forced to abdicate, and even then, she negotiated the terms. She didn't flee, she didn't fall, she retired. Wu Zetian died in peace. No emperor after her ever let a woman come that close to power again, which makes her not just a ruler, but a warning to history, to patriarchy, to those who believe that love and leadership can't coexist in the same woman. If she had lovers, she had them on her terms. If she had power, it was earned. And if she had enemies, they were mostly trying to rewrite her story before the ink had dried. Next, we turn to a queen who didn't just navigate marriages, she weaponized them. A woman who married, betrayed, and buried multiple kings, sometimes in the same month. Her love life wasn't a subplot. It was the succession plan. Empress Cleopatra Thea, Seleucid Empire. In the exhausted twilight of the Seleucid Empire, what was left of Alexander the Great's dream of a united East and West, a queen named Cleopatra Thea ruled with a kind of icy pragmatism that made generals nervous and husbands die. Early. She didn't wait for power to be handed to her. She married it 3 times and outlived them all. Most people only know one Cleopatra, the famous one, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the one with eyeliner and Roman lovers and cinematic death scenes. But the name Cleopatra was a family tradition. And Cleopatra Thea, living over a century earlier, bore it with far less theatre and far more efficiency. Born in 164 BCE to Ptolemy VI of Egypt and Cleopatra II, yes, the dynasty really liked to recycle names. Cleopatra Thea was royal from birth and politically useful from the moment she could be traded. Egypt was still powerful. The Seleucid Empire, its cousin to the northeast, was less so. And like all struggling dynasties, the Seleucids needed a wife with pedigree. Enter Thea, a teenage girl with Egyptian blood and a Ptolemaic education, married off to cement peace. Her first husband was Alexander Ballas, a pretender to the Seleucid throne propped up by Roman rumors. Their marriage was strategic, a show of support from Egypt. But once Balas proved too erratic to hold power, her father turned on him and arranged for her to marry his rival instead. One husband out, another in. No drama, just diplomacy. She moved from one royal bedchamber to another like a courier delivering peace treaties. No time for scandal, just succession. Her second husband, Demetrius II, was briefly successful until he was captured in battle and sent off to live in exile by a Parthian king. Cleopatra Thea, she stayed in Antioch, held court, raised children, and waited. Enter husband number 3, Antiochus VII, another brother in the tangled Seleucid family tree, and another man who needed legitimacy. Legitimacy Thea could provide. She married him too, of course. And when he was killed in battle, guess what happened next? Demetrius II was released from Parthian exile and returned to Syria. Thea married him again. Let's pause. Yes, she married the same man twice after he'd been gone for nearly a decade, after she'd already married someone else, and after she'd raised at least 2 of his sons in his absence. This wasn't love. This was management. Cleopatra Thea treated marriage the way generals treat terrain, something to be crossed, occupied, and defended. But even she had her limits. By the time Demetrius returned, he was not the man who had left. Weary, indecisive, and increasingly unpopular, he quickly lost the support of the army and the court. And Thea, watching his slow political collapse from her seat beside him, decided that enough was enough. In 125 BCE, when Demetrius tried to flee the chaos of his crumbling reign, Thea refused to go with him. He was murdered not long after. Was she behind it? The records are careful not to say, but let's just say she wasn't heartbroken. Now widowed again, Thea could have stepped back, but she didn't. She crowned her son Seleucus V as king and ruled alongside him, briefly, until he got too ambitious. Some sources say he tried to rule without her. Others suggest he may have taken too many liberties with his mother's authority. So Thea had him killed, her own son, executed in the palace. And then she installed a younger son, Antiochus VIII, as co-ruler. This time, she kept tighter control. But the thing about raising kings is that eventually they notice they're holding a sword. In 121 BCE, Cleopatra Thea prepared a cup of wine for her son, a gesture of peace, or maybe an execution in progress. We'll never know for sure. What we do know is that Antiochus VIII, whether out of suspicion, intuition, or raw survival instinct, refused to drink it, and instead made her drink it herself. She died, poisoned, allegedly by her own hand, forced by her own son. Poetic? Sure, but this isn't a morality tale. This is a record of a woman who lived in a collapsing empire, surrounded by weak husbands, rebellious sons, and fragile alliances, and managed to survive longer than any of them. Her love life wasn't romantic, it was logistical. Cleopatra Thea didn't sleep her way to the top. She stayed awake. She outmaneuvered. She made marriage a weapon and motherhood a form of succession control. If she felt affection, it was buried beneath the demands of rule. If she grieved, she did it in silence, behind the throne. And now, from a queen who wielded power through family ties and lethal domesticity, we shift to a warrior empress who rose with fire in her blood and a nation in her fist. She didn't inherit power. She took it from the ashes and dared to strike fear into Rome itself. Queen Zenobia Palmyra. If Cleopatra died trying to resist Rome, Zenobia lived by conquering its provinces. She wasn't a footnote in Roman history, she was a headache, a humiliation, and a reminder that empires are not immortal. From the sands of Palmyra, a city that shimmered with trade routes and stolen gods, Zenobia rose not as a rebel, but as a queen with a plan, and for a brief moment, it worked. Palmyra was no ordinary city. Sitting between the Roman and Persian worlds, it had become a wealthy oasis state, one that knew how to smile at both empires while paying tribute to neither. When Zenobia's husband, King Odaenathus, was assassinated under suspicious circumstances, aren't they always? She didn't fade into widowhood. She stepped forward. Officially, she ruled as regent for her young son. Unofficially, she was in charge. And she didn't rule cautiously. Zenobia expanded Palmyra's borders almost overnight. Egypt, Syria, parts of Arabia, entire Roman provinces simply flipped. She declared herself the Queen of Kings and began styling her son with imperial titles. Roman ones that echoed Caesar. It was subtle rebellion, draped in maternal devotion and royal dignity. Rome was not amused. Emperor Aurelian was dealing with chaos in the West and didn't have the bandwidth to deal with an Eastern queen building her own empire on the bones of Roman governors. But Zenobia didn't wait for his attention. She marched into Egypt, then a crown jewel of Roman holdings, and claimed it for herself. And here the legend blooms. She marched with troops, rode on horseback, and issued decrees in multiple languages. She was, reportedly, fluent in Aramaic, Greek, Egyptian, and Latin. A polyglot monarch in a time when most rulers struggled with anything beyond swordplay. The Roman historians, naturally, were skeptical. How could a woman lead armies, debate philosophy, and govern a vast territory? Clearly, she was too clever for her own good, dangerous, ambitious, probably not even feminine. One source described her as chaste, a backhanded way of saying, she didn't sleep around, but we're still afraid of her. As for her love life, it disappears almost entirely after her husband's death, which is interesting, given how thoroughly history documents royal affairs. Either she had no lovers, or none worth remembering. Either she rejected entanglements, or she ruled so effectively that no one dared reduce her to them. And maybe that's the real scandal. Because when Aurelian finally turned his attention east, he came with overwhelming force. He crushed her armies, besieged Palmyra, and forced Zenobia to flee. She was captured while attempting to escape, legend says, on a camel in full royal regalia. And then the usual erasure began. She was paraded through Rome in golden chains during Aurelian's triumph. Humiliated, displayed, broken. Except she wasn't. Depending on the version, Zenobia didn't die in prison. She was pardoned, married off to a Roman senator, given a villa, lived out her life in Italy, reading books and raising children. Not exactly the fate of a defeated rebel queen. So what do we make of her? Zenobia's greatest crime was not conquest. It was competence. She dared to govern like an emperor, and the world responded by reducing her to a curiosity. A Palmyrene Cleopatra. As if she needed the comparison. As if her military campaigns, political reforms, and intellectual acumen weren't enough to justify her own mythology. She didn't rule through seduction, she ruled through strategy. And her downfall? It wasn't moral, it was logistical. But the empire she tried to carve, the idea of an Eastern monarchy that could rival Rome, never quite died. It just changed names, changed flags, but the desert remembers. And speaking of deserts, the next queen rode into battle with a sword in one hand and a baby on her back. To the British, she was a Jezebel. To her people, a mother of revolution. Her name still makes colonizers nervous. Rani Lakshmi Bai, Jhansi, India. In 1857, the British Empire learned that India's queens were not decorative. They bled, they commanded, they burned down the rules of engagement. And at the center of that awakening stood Rani Lakshmibai of Jhansi, a woman so deeply misunderstood that even her enemies couldn't agree on whether she was a villain or a symbol. They just knew she was dangerous. Lakshmibai wasn't born royal. She was born Manikarnika Tambe in Varanasi, into a Maratha family that trained daughters in swordplay and scriptures. She was riding horses before most girls were old enough to braid their hair. She learned archery, Sanskrit, and politics, though none of this was supposed to matter. Until, of course, it did. She married the Maharaja of Jhansi and became queen. The marriage was politically useful, though not legendary. But then came tragedy. Her husband died. Their biological child died. The Maharaja adopted a son on his deathbed, a common practice recognized under Hindu law. But British law didn't care. The East India Company invoked the doctrine of lapse, a policy that allowed them to annex any princely state without a natural male heir. Jhansi, they claimed, now belonged to the British Crown. Lakshmibai refused. Refused politely at first, then politically, then violently. When the Indian Rebellion of 1857 broke out, it wasn't just a mutiny, it was a powder keg of anger against colonial rule, taxation, land seizure, and cultural humiliation. Rani Lakshmibai found herself at its center. At first, she denied any involvement. She tried diplomacy, letters, appeals. The British didn't believe her, so she changed tactics. She donned battle armor, mounted her horse, took command of the Jhansi forces, both men and women. Yes, she formed a women's brigade. Yes, they fought hard. Eyewitnesses described her riding into battle with her young adopted son strapped to her back, wielding a sword in either hand. Whether that image is entirely accurate doesn't matter. What matters is that it lasted. The British were stunned. Queens were supposed to faint, not fight. The Times of London called her the Jezebel of India, a name soaked in colonial scorn and biblical misogyny. But even in those articles, something else bled through. Respect. They couldn't dismiss her. She had become myth while still alive. Jhansi held out against siege after siege, until finally it fell. But Lakshmibai didn't die with it. She escaped, regrouped, allied with rebel leaders like Tatya Tope. She kept fighting even as the rebellion was crushed in other regions. The British considered her one of the last serious threats to their consolidation of power. She was killed in combat in 1858, 20-something years old. A widow, a mother, a general, a ghost. They tried to bury her story. They called her insurgent, traitor, fanatic, but they couldn't erase the legacy. In India, she became a national symbol of resistance. Statues were built, streets were named, poems were written. Her name was taught not as scandal, but as scripture. And her love life? There isn't one, at least. Not in the romantic sense. No lovers, no affairs, no palace intrigue. She was married once, widowed once, devoted not to passion, but to rebellion. The British tried to scandalize her with metaphors. Failed. There was nothing to expose, just resolve. In the end, Rani Lakshmibai didn't lose because she was weak. She lost because the empire was bigger, colder, and better funded. But even as she died, she proved something dangerous to the colonial mind, that women do not require permission to lead revolutions. Next, we leave the battlefield and enter the marble-walled harem of an empire even the British once feared. a queen who played her role perfectly until she didn't. A Mughal empress who shaped policy, art, and inheritance behind a veil of quiet power. Mariam-uz-Zamani, Mughal Empire. Her name is missing from many textbooks, erased behind the more flamboyant shadows of Shah Jahan's Taj Mahal or Mumtaz Mahal's tragic romance. But Mariam-uz-Zamani, also known as Harka Bai or Joda Bai, was not merely the Hindu wife of a Muslim emperor. She was not a romantic anecdote in Akbar's rise. She was a quiet revolution in silk. A queen whose power moved like incense through the corridors of the Mughal court, subtle, permeating, impossible to ignore. She married the Mughal Emperor Akbar in 1562, a Rajput princess offered to the empire not just for diplomacy, but for survival. Rajput kingdoms were being crushed or absorbed. Her father chose alliance over resistance, and Mariam, just a teenager, was the offering. The usual script, yes, but what she did with it? Unscripted. Akbar was no fool. He knew that marrying a Hindu princess wasn't just optics, it was strategy. And Mariam played her part, but she didn't convert. That, in itself, was radical. The empress of an Islamic empire who openly practiced her faith. She had her own temples, her own priests, her own festivals. She didn't hide her gods, she brought them into the imperial calendar. And Akbar allowed it. More than allowed it, he embraced it. His court transformed into a cosmopolitan experiment in pluralism. And at the center of that experiment was Mariam, silent in most official records, but ever present in the decisions that shaped an empire. She bore him a son, Salim, later Emperor Jahangir, after years of childlessness. That alone elevated her status, but she didn't fade into domesticity. Instead, she became one of the wealthiest women in the empire, a trader, a shipowner. Yes, this Mughal empress financed trading expeditions to the Persian Gulf and Southeast Asia. She had her own seal, her own revenue streams, her own merchant fleets. Not romantic enough? Sorry. She was too busy running empires. What's remarkable is how little scandal clung to her. In an age when royal women were sequestered, every whisper amplified, Mariam remained above the noise. Not because she was absent, but because she was respected. Her relationship with Akbar wasn't the dramatic sort historians drool over. It was functional, durable, and clearly built on something stronger than sentiment, mutual interest. That doesn't mean it lacked affection. The very title Akbar gave her, Mariam-uz-Zamani, Mary of the Age, echoes with reverence. She was more than consort. She was a symbol of the empire's soul, diverse, unified, enigmatic, and yet we know so little about her inner life. No letters, no diaries, no court poets composing verses of her beauty or tragedy. She exists in ledgers, edicts, trade documents, and, of course, the bloodline. Every Mughal emperor after Akbar carried her Rajput DNA. Her love story, if we dare to call it that, was not written in poetry, it was written in policy. She didn't fight battles, but she redefined the front lines of culture, tolerance, and economics. She didn't scandalize the empire, she stabilized it. And in doing so, she became the rarest of historical anomalies. A powerful woman with no asterisk. Next, we travel to the modern age. To a woman who wore tiaras and sorrow like matching accessories. A queen who married into two nations and ended up belonging to neither. Whose beauty was a political currency, and whose love story was more elegant tragedy than statecraft. Queen Fawzia of Egypt and Iran. She was the kind of beautiful that made diplomats nervous. Queen Fauzia of Egypt, princess by birth, empress by marriage, was photographed more often than quoted, displayed more than heard. She was called the most beautiful woman in the world by Western journalists, a title that sounds like a crown until you realize it's a cage. Born in 1921 into Egypt's royal family, Fauzia was raised in a palace built more for French opulence than Arab tradition. She spoke French before Arabic, wore Dior before she ever touched a hijab. Her world was one of pearls, protocols, and political pressure, all while Egypt itself simmered beneath British occupation and nationalist unrest. And then came Iran. In 1939, at just 17 years old, Fauzia was married to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the future Shah of Iran. The match was a geopolitical arrangement, a royal bridge between two ancient civilizations. Egypt hoped to elevate its prestige in the Islamic world. Iran sought legitimacy through marriage to a more glamorous monarchy. Fauzia was the offering. Again. The wedding was extravagant. The photographs were dazzling. But the palace in Tehran was colder than Cairo, literally and metaphorically. The marriage deteriorated quickly. Cultural differences, political tensions, and the Shah's growing paranoia created an atmosphere of isolation. Fauzia, once a star of the Egyptian court, found herself trapped in a gilded cage thousands of miles from home. Her letters from the time what little survives speak in code. I am fine, meaning I am forgotten. Her health declined. Her smile became ceremonial. She bore the Shah, a daughter, Shahnaz, in 1940. But that did little to secure her place. Iran expected a male heir, and Fauzia, increasingly seen as a foreign accessory rather than a partner, faded into diplomatic silence. In 1945, she left. Not in the middle of the night, not dramatically, just quietly. She returned to Egypt and never went back. The divorce was finalized 2 years later. The Shah remarried. Fauzia, miraculously, did not disappear. She remarried a lesser Egyptian noble, had another child, and lived far from the spotlight, outlasting 2 monarchies and most of her generation. Her beauty remained legendary, but what's more remarkable is how little else was said about her. No scandals, no affairs, no interviews, just silence. As if the world, having once elevated her to the height of royal fantasy, had nothing to say once she refused to play the role. Fauzia's love life, unlike most queens on this list, reads like a resignation letter written in perfume. She didn't weaponize her marriage. She endured it. She didn't scandalize empires. She slipped between them, like mist. But make no mistake, she wasn't weak. She survived the fall of 2 royal dynasties. She raised children in a world where her lineage was both a blessing and a target. She lived through revolutions, exile, and irrelevance. And she did so with a kind of deliberate invisibility that almost feels like protest. Her photo still floats through Pinterest boards, fashion retrospectives, forgotten archives, but her voice, still missing, still waiting. From royal sacrifice to royal silence, we now enter the salons of 18th century Europe, where a queen plays her power behind music and metaphysics, where philosophy and flirtation become the same language, and the rumors never quite match the reality. Queen Sophia, Charlotte, possibly England. There are queens who rule empires, and then there are queens who haunt drawing rooms. Queen Sophia Charlotte belonged to the latter. Not quite a ruler, not quite a romantic icon. She sat at the edge of history, like a misplaced bookmark, discussed more for what she may have symbolized than for what she actually did. Depending on who you ask, she was a philosopher queen, a cultural patron, or, controversially, the first Black Queen of England. And yet, even those bold claims can't fully capture the strange quiet of her presence. Born in 1744 inches, the small German duchy of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, Sophia Charlotte was never meant for the world stage. She was noble, yes, but hardly a major player in the dynastic chessboard of Europe. Still, she was young, Protestant, and available. And when King George III of Britain needed a politically convenient and religiously suitable wife, her name floated to the top of the list. They married in 1761, sight unseen, practically strangers. He met her on a Thursday. They were wed the same evening. Not exactly a sweeping romance. Yet by the lukewarm standards of royal marriages, theirs was surprisingly functional. George III was known for being temperate, sober, and obsessively domestic. Sophia Charlotte, by all accounts, shared his devotion to routine and propriety. They had 15 children, 15, one for nearly every year of their marriage. But children were not her only legacy. She was a patron of the arts. She maintained correspondence with philosophers, supported musicians, and championed botanical studies. She helped fund the construction of Kew Gardens. She hosted Mozart. She kept a personal collection of scientific instruments, which wasn't exactly the norm for 18th century queens. And though she rarely meddled in politics, her intellectual presence was unmistakable. Even Voltaire, ever the cynic, noted her refined conversation. But beyond the tea and the temperance was a different rumor, one whispered through time, resurfacing in recent decades, that Sophia Charlotte may have been of African descent. The claim traces back to portraits, contemporary descriptions, and genealogical speculation. Her features, some said, were unmistakably African. Her ancestry, traced through Portuguese royalty, included distant Moors. And suddenly, a new image was born. The first Black Queen of England. It's a provocative claim, and not without merit, but also not without skepticism. The racial classification of historical figures, especially those several centuries removed, requires more than artful interpretation. The evidence remains inconclusive, the debate ongoing. But what's more interesting than her race is the fact that this is what people talk about when they talk about Sophia Charlotte. Not her intellect, not her legacy, her image, her body, her proximity to power and pigment, which tells you something about history. As a queen, she was never scandalous. She was never reckless. She lived through the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and the unraveling of colonial empires. And through it all, she remained largely invisible in the headlines, overshadowed by louder queens, more tragic consorts, and the mental unraveling of her husband. Yes, that happened too. George III eventually lost his mind, not metaphorically medically. The madness of King George became a national crisis. And Sophia Charlotte? She didn't flee. She didn't conspire. She stayed. Managing the royal household, protecting her children, enduring the collapse of the man she married. Not with flair, with duty. Which may be why she's rarely remembered. She didn't start wars. She didn't start rumors. She simply existed clever, restrained, and quietly influential. And from her candle-lit salons, we now move to a different kind of queen. One who didn't compose sonatas but commanded armies. A warrior wrapped in myth. A woman said to take lovers like trophies, then disappear into the night. Whether she ruled with freedom or ferocity depends on who's telling the story. But either way, Queen Amina was not made for palaces. She was made for conquest. Queen Amina, Zazzau, Nigeria. There are queens who are remembered for how they ruled, And then there are queens who are remembered for how they rode. Queen Amina of Zazau didn't sit on a throne, she rode beside it, sword in hand, armor glinting beneath the Sahel Sunday. She was a legend in motion, a force so mythologized that separating fact from folklore feels almost disrespectful, because in the end, what mattered wasn't what she did exactly, it was that she could. Zazau. Now Zaria, in modern-day Nigeria, was one of the Hausa city-states in the 16th century, rich with trade, agriculture, and strategic power. Amina was born into royalty, the granddaughter of King Sarkin and the daughter of Queen Bakwa Turunku, who herself had broken precedent by becoming ruler. Amina was trained not in courtly graces, but in warfare. Spear training, horseback riding, battlefield strategy. This was no debutante ball. This was war school. By the time her mother died, Amina was already leading the army. She ascended the throne around 1576, not as a placeholder or figurehead, but as a conqueror. And what followed was nearly 30 years of expansion. City after city fell under her command. She built fortifications, known today as Amina's Walls, across northern Nigeria. She imposed tribute systems. She demanded respect. She got it. Her reign marked the height of Zazau's power. Caravans from Timbuktu and Cairo crossed her territory. Horses, salt, gold and slaves all flowed through her cities. Amina didn't just expand territory, she controlled economics, the arteries of empire. And then came the stories. It is said that she took lovers from the territory she conquered, young men who would spend the night in her bed, only to be executed at dawn to preserve her independence. There's no direct evidence of this, of course. It reads more like symbolic exaggeration than fact. A metaphor for domination, perhaps. Or just a colonial-era smear reshaped into folklore. Because once again, the world struggles to imagine a woman holding power without seducing someone for it. So Amina is transformed from strategist to siren, from general to femme fatale. But maybe, just maybe, she wanted that myth. Maybe the stories kept her safe. Maybe the fear of being her next conquest protected her borders better than any stone wall. What's undeniable is that she was real. The oral histories remember her. The walls remain. The maps changed. Her impact was not fabricated, it was inherited. Zazau's identity was shaped by her leadership, her military expansion, her imposition of law. She never married, never bore children, never softened her image. And for that, she's been both worshipped and weaponized. In modern Nigeria, she's remembered as a feminist icon, a national symbol, a mythic ancestor. Statues of her stand tall, schools bear her name, but still some whisper about those lovers, as if that's what defined her, as if conquest and courage weren't enough. So what if she did take lovers? So what if she didn't? The obsession itself is the answer. Power in a woman's hands, especially power wielded with a blade, must always be explained, softened, humanized, or sexualized. Queen Amina refused all of it. She was a queen who fought, a ruler who rode, a legend who lived. And next, we stay on the African continent, but enter an empire built on isolation, mystery, and blood. A queen who ruled through terror, survival, and calculated cruelty. A woman whose love life, if it existed, was buried under the weight of her throne. Queen Ranavalona, I, Madagascar. If you were a European merchant in the 19th century and you found yourself summoned to the court of Queen Ranavalona, I of Madagascar, you had two choices: behave or disappear. Her court didn't operate by the rules of diplomacy. It operated by hers. And no, they weren't written down. Ranavalona, I often dubbed the Mad Queen of Madagascar by Western historians, ruled from 1828 to 1861, but mad is the label used by empires when a ruler doesn't roll over. She wasn't mad, she was methodical. And her reign, though infamous for its brutality, was rooted in something far more complex than bloodlust: survival. She was born as Rabido Andrianampoina Marina, a name that would break most colonial clerks, and rose from a relatively obscure position in the Marina royal family to the throne. Her claim wasn't automatic, it was engineered. Her husband, King Radama I, died without a clear heir. According to legend, Ranavalona made her move before the mourning garb had even settled. She secured the loyalty of key military factions, eliminated her rivals literally, and declared herself monarch. And then, the doors closed. During her husband's reign, Madagascar had begun embracing European influence, Christianity, European advisors, Western-style schooling. Ranavalona saw it differently. She saw erosion, cultural dilution, and she decided to put a stop to it, swiftly. Missionaries were expelled, churches demolished, European influence curtailed. She revived traditional practices, reinstated local spiritual systems, and demanded absolute loyalty not just to the crown, but to the identity of Madagascar itself. This is where her reputation turns dark. Yes, her rule was violent. Punishments were severe. Trials by ordeal returned where the accused would drink poison to prove innocence. Dissenters vanished. The population reportedly decreased by hundreds of thousands, though such numbers come mostly from foreign accounts with imperial agendas. But behind the fear was also a bizarre kind of control. Ranavalona was no puppet. She refused treaties, resisted colonization, and kept both the British and French at bay during a time when entire continents were being sliced into colonial pie. As for her personal life, it was just as tightly choreographed. Ranavalona had lovers, yes, but not in the palace romance sense. She selected and dismissed consorts with the same ruthlessness she applied to her ministers. Intimacy wasn't emotional, it was bureaucratic. Men came and went, rewarded when useful, discarded when inconvenient. Some rose to political prominence, others quietly disappeared. Her most enduring relationship was with a man named Andrianisa, a commoner turned general who became her closest advisor and possibly her lover. He helped her consolidate power and suppress rebellion. Their relationship, personal or political, was built on shared ambition. There's no record of love letters, no romantic poetry, just the efficient machinery of rule. And yet, Ranavalona wasn't immune to contradiction. She was obsessed with tradition, but dressed in European military uniforms. She hated colonialism, but imported cannons and chandeliers. She outlawed Christianity, yet allowed certain foreign traders to operate under strict surveillance. She was a tyrant and a nationalist, a villain to outsiders, a defender of sovereignty to some within. When she died in 1861, the world exhaled. European newspapers wrote obituaries with thinly veiled relief. Her successor, Radama II, quickly reversed many of her policies, opening Madagascar to European trade and influence. Within a few decades, the island would fall under full French colonial rule. Ranavalona had delayed the inevitable, but for over 30 years, she made sure Madagascar stayed out of European hands. No treaties, no colonies, no compromises. Her legacy is still debated. Some see her as a despot who stifled progress, others as a queen who fought cultural genocide with whatever tools she had. Either way, She didn't play the Empress of Passion or the romantic tragic queen. She wasn't warm. She wasn't poetic. She was an iron gate, a wall that said, "Not here, not yet." Next, we drift across the Pacific to a kingdom where songs still remember the queen who lost her country but never her dignity. A woman whose romantic choices were entangled with Western influence, political manipulation, and betrayal disguised as diplomacy. Her heart may have wanted harmony, but her crown was stolen before the music stopped. Queen Liliuokalani, Hawaii. To understand Queen Liliuokalani is to understand the sound of a door closing, slowly, painfully, on a kingdom that once stood proud and sovereign, surrounded by ocean and now surrounded by sharks. She was born in 1838 into the royal house of Kamehameha, at a time when the Hawaiian kingdom was already teetering under foreign influence. American missionaries had arrived, sugar plantations had taken root, and the US had begun eyeing the islands not as a neighbor, but as a future property. Liliuokalani was educated in missionary schools, fluent in English and Hawaiian, a composer of hymns and protest songs. She believed in diplomacy. She believed in Christianity. She believed, perhaps too optimistically, that peace could be negotiated. She ascended the throne in 1891 after the death of her brother, King Kalakaua. What she inherited wasn't a kingdom, it was a hostage situation. American businessmen, known as the Committee of Safety, already controlled much of the economy. They had forced her predecessor to sign the Bayonet Constitution, which stripped the monarchy of power and transferred it to a legislature dominated by white landowners. Liliuokalani tried to undo it. She proposed a new constitution restoring the power of the monarchy and giving native Hawaiians the vote again. The people cheered. The businessmen panicked. The United States, seeing instability where they had created it, sent in the Marines. On the 17th of January, 1893, Liliuokalani was overthrown in a bloodless coup. No shots fired. Just a queen standing in her palace, refusing to fight her own people. She surrendered, formally, to avoid violence. "I yield to the superior force of the United States," she wrote. It wasn't defeat, it was grace under pressure. As for her personal life, Liliuokalani had married John Owen Dominus, an American-born member of the Hawaiian nobility. Their marriage was complicated. He was emotionally distant, politically ambiguous, and possibly unfaithful. She remained devoted more to duty than to romance. But her deepest relationship was with her people. She wrote songs, over 150 of them, including the haunting Aloha Oe, a farewell to her homeland, her throne, her freedom. It wasn't just a love song. It was an elegy, a soft rebellion in melody. After the coup, she was imprisoned in her own palace for nearly a year. She spent her confinement sewing a quilt stitched with the history of her fall. No rants, no rage, just thread and silence. Later, she traveled to Washington to plead for the restoration of her kingdom. She met with President Cleveland, who expressed sympathy but did nothing. Congress ignored her. The annexation of Hawaii rolled forward, slow and inevitable. In 1898, Hawaii became a U.S. territory. She lived the rest of her life in quiet resistance. No throne, no army, just a pen, a songbook, a people who never forgot. Her romantic life was unremarkable. Her political life was unforgettable. She didn't take lovers. She took loss and turned it into legacy. Today, her statue stands outside Iolani Palace, watching over a land still struggling with its own history. Tourists take selfies there. Few realize the women in bronze once ruled a kingdom stolen without a single shot. Next, we leave the Pacific for the dry wind of a very different kind of monarchy, one caught between tradition, progress, and personal betrayal. A queen married off for reform, discarded for convenience, and remembered not for love, but for what it couldn't save. Queen Soraya, Afghanistan. In a landlocked country carved by mountains and empire, where dust settled faster than peace, Queen Soraya Tarzi emerged like a disruption, a woman who looked directly into the camera lens and didn't flinch. In early 20th century Afghanistan, that was the equivalent of revolution. She was born in 1899 inches Damascus, where her family lived in exile after her grandfather had been driven from Kabul. Her father, Mahmoud Tarzi, was a reformist intellectual and early Afghan nationalist. He believed in newspapers, in reason, in the radical idea that women could learn, think, and govern. Soraya believed too. She read poetry, studied world politics, and spoke several languages. The foundation was laid. What followed was improvisation. In 1919, she married King Amanullah Khan, the modernizing monarch of Afghanistan, who had just taken the throne in the aftermath of his father's assassination. It was a love match, rare for royalty. He didn't just want a queen to decorate his reign, he wanted a partner. He found one. From the beginning, Queen Soraya was no silent consort. She appeared unveiled in public, often standing by her husband's side during speeches, reviews of the military, and diplomatic visits. She founded schools for girls, opened women's clinics, advocated for literacy, not as charity, but as a matter of national identity. She edited magazines, wrote essays, carried herself like a future that hadn't happened yet. Afghanistan wasn't ready. The reforms were sweeping, fast, and depending on who you asked, reckless. Amanullah declared independence from British interference, restructured the legal system, and pushed secular education. Soraya pushed even further. She gave public speeches calling for equal rights. She ripped off her veil in front of a crowd of men, not for spectacle, for principle. The message was clear. Progress isn't asking for permission. But progress tends to make enemies, and Soraya made them efficiently. Traditionalists, clerics, tribal leaders they watched with mounting horror. A queen with a pen was one thing. A queen with a platform was something else entirely. Foreign observers loved her. The West wrote glowing articles. Time magazine put her on the cover. She was called Afghanistan's feminist queen, as if her femininity needed footnoting. Her romantic life, ironically, wasn't scandalous. She was deeply loyal to Amanullah. Their marriage was political, emotional, and intellectual. They traveled Europe together like rock stars of reform. In Paris, she gave interviews. In Berlin, she shook hands with chancellors. In London, she was photographed wearing pearls, her hair in a short bob. To many Afghans, she might as well have been from Mars. And then, the backlash. By 1929, rebellion brewed. The economy faltered. Conservative forces, furious about the pace of reform, rallied around a man named Habibullah Kalakani. Amanullah abdicated under pressure. He fled with Soraya and their family, first to India, then Italy. Their reign was over. Their revolution paused. They lived in exile, quietly, graciously, uneasily. Soraya never returned to Afghanistan. She spent the rest of her life in Europe, watching her homeland stumble through cycles of monarchy, coups, and invasions. She died in 1968, decades before her country would see her vision realized or buried completely. Her name is still controversial. In some circles, she's a symbol of premature reform. In others, she's remembered as a feminist saint. And still, some simply ignore her altogether, as if erasing her could undo what she dared to suggest, that Afghanistan could be ruled by a queen who did not whisper. Her love story was not a tabloid headline, it was a nation-building blueprint. From the marble streets of Rome, we now return to the cold elegance of Vienna, to a woman so beloved and so mourned that her tragedy has been lacquered over with nostalgia. Her love life was poetry, her death a shadow, and her legend too beautiful to fact-check. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, Sisi. You don't become a myth just by being beautiful. You become a myth by being difficult, by wanting freedom in a place built on protocol. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, known to the world as Sisi, didn't break the rules. She simply refused to acknowledge them. Born in 1837 into Bavarian nobility, Sisi was a dreamy, unpolished teenager more interested in poetry and horses than diplomacy. Her cousin, Emperor Franz Joseph, was originally intended to marry her older sister. But when he met Sisi, he changed his mind. She was 15. He was 23. And within days, she was engaged. It sounds romantic. It wasn't. From the moment she entered the Habsburg court, Sisi was suffocated. The Viennese elite disliked her lack of polish. The Dowager Empress, her mother-in-law, disliked her independence. And Sisi, for her part, disliked nearly everything. She struggled with the structure, the surveillance, the idea that her body now belonged to a dynasty. She bore Franz Joseph several children, and then the system took them. Her firstborn daughter died young. Her son, Crown Prince Rudolf, grew up distant and doomed. Her marriage, though polite, was a partnership in name only. Franz Joseph was stable, unimaginative, and increasingly dependent on Sisi for affection he didn't know how to earn. Sisi, meanwhile, wandered. She became obsessed with her appearance, maintained a 19-inch waist through punishing diets and hours of exercise, refused to be photographed after a certain age. She was considered one of the most beautiful women in Europe, but she treated her face like a mask she could never take off. She traveled constantly, Greece, Hungary, Ireland. She refused to stay still, refused to age publicly, refused to become the empress they wanted. In Hungary, she found a kind of second home, learned the language, embraced the culture, and used her charm to broker political compromise between Austria and its restive partner. And then, of course, came the scandals. Did she have affairs? Maybe. Her close relationship with Hungarian statesmen Gyula and Rasi raised eyebrows. There were rumors, letters, glances. Nothing concrete. Just enough to keep court gossip factories running. Her son, Rudolf, died in 1,889 inches, a suicide pact with his mistress, an event that shattered her. After that, she withdrew almost entirely from public life, wore only black, traveled incognito, wrote haunting poems about death and memory. She became a ghost with a title, and then she was murdered. In 1898, while in Geneva, she was stabbed in the chest by an Italian anarchist. He didn't know her. He was just looking for a royal. She died slowly, in agony, unaware she'd been mortally wounded until it was too late. She collapsed beside a lake. The empress who had spent her whole life fleeing attention, now dragged back into it by tragedy. Her death turned her into an icon. Statues rose. Romances were written. Films made. Her life, scrubbed of its melancholy, became fairy tale. The unhappy girl who became the reluctant queen. The misunderstood beauty the imperial victim. But Sisi was never passive. She was never just a princess in a tower. She was angry, restless, politically sharp. She negotiated. She argued. She suffered, yes, but she resisted. Not with declarations, but with disappearance. Her love life? Still a question mark. Her power? Hidden in silks and syllables. But her legacy is no longer hers. It belongs to everyone who ever looked at a crown and thought, "No, thank you." From Vienna's glittering ruins, we return to Madagascar this time, not with violence, but with calculated conversion. A queen who replaced fear with faith, swords with scripture, and yet still married politics like it was her birthright. Because in the end, every throne is just a pulpit waiting for the right queen to speak. Queen Ranavalona, 2, Madagascar. By the time Queen Ranavalona II took the throne in 1868, Madagascar had already flirted with isolationism, conversion, rebellion, and resistance. Her predecessor Ranavalona I had made sure of that. For 30 years, the kingdom had stood apart from European influence under an iron policy of cultural preservation and religious crackdown. Missionaries had been expelled, converts punished. The church kept far outside the palace gates. Ranavalona II reversed all of it, but not in the way anyone expected. She wasn't a revolutionary. She was a realist, and if you're looking for a queen who slept with anyone for power, you're not going to find it here. What you will find is something more insidious. A queen who married religion instead of romance, and in doing so, rewired the fate of her kingdom quietly, permanently, and on her own terms. Born as Ramoma, she came to power as the designated heir of Queen Rasoherina, another formidable ruler in a long line of Marina queens. At this point, the monarchy of Madagascar was already unusual by global standards. Women had ruled, undisputed, for decades. There were no boy kings waiting in the wings, no male regents pulling strings behind the curtain, just queens, and a council of Hova nobles making sure their authority didn't tip too far in any direction. Ranavalona II's coronation was drenched in ritual, but also in hesitation. The country was at a crossroads. Christianity had been bubbling up beneath the surface since the British and Norwegian missionaries returned under Rasoherina. The younger generation, those raised in schools quietly run by foreigners, were increasingly leaning toward this new religion, this imported ideology dressed up as salvation. Ranavalona II didn't just convert to Christianity, she made it law. In 1869, she publicly declared herself a Protestant Christian, baptized by the royal chaplain, and ordered the burning of royal idols. Overnight, the queen who wore the name of her isolationist ancestor Ranavalona, I became the Queen of Reform. Temples were demolished, churches erected, mission schools expanded. The Bible replaced the old customs as the state's official guide. But this wasn't a religious awakening, it was a political maneuver. Ranavalona II knew what the missionaries didn't, that Madagascar could not survive another century by clinging to tradition alone. The French and British weren't just hovering, they were hungry. Converting to Christianity wasn't about faith, it was about aligning with Western powers without handing them a key to the front gate. She made her people Christian, yes, but she kept them sovereign. She remained politically shrewd, reinforcing the monarchy's relationship with the Protestant Church while resisting French Catholic influence. Her court adopted European clothing, European customs, but still operated in Malagasy. Her administration modernized public works, expanded literacy, and codified laws, but never let go of the land itself. As for her romantic history, sparse, controlled, uninteresting by design. She never remarried after her first husband's death, a man named Rainilaya Rivani, who also served as her prime minister. He was a man of towering bureaucratic ambition and little public affection. Their partnership was strategic, the kind of alliance where documents replaced love letters. She didn't need him, he needed her crown to legitimize his reforms. No scandal, no harem, no fainting lovers in hallways. Ranavalona II wasn't a queen of pleasure. She was a queen of policy. And yet, her embrace of Christianity left a complicated legacy. For some, she is remembered as the modernizer who brought literacy, hospitals, and education to her people. For others, she is the queen who opened the gates to cultural erasure, who traded sacred stones for foreign scripture. She ruled for 17 years. When she died in 1883, the groundwork had been laid. Her successors would struggle to maintain what she had built. The French, undeterred by her balancing act, would eventually colonize Madagascar in 1896. But Ranavalona II wasn't naive. She knew this was a long game. Her marriage was to power itself, her religion a contract, her reign a strategic pause before the fall. Next, we move further back into the ancient sands of Nubia, where another queen ruled not just as consort, but as co-sovereign. A warrior in a crown, a builder of temples, and perhaps, if rumors are to be entertained, a woman who lived with more freedom than her male counterparts ever allowed for, Queen Amanitor. Nubia. Before Egypt had Cleopatra, before Rome began its slow hunger for the world, Nubia had its own queens, Kandakes, as they were called, warrior queens, sovereign women, not royal accessories, but ruling bodies in their own right. And among them, Queen Amanitori stands out not for scandal, but for what she built. Stone by stone, kingdom by kingdom, legend by legend. She ruled in the 1st century CE, during the Meroitic period of the Kingdom of Kush, centered in what is now Sudan. Her name appears alongside her son or consort King Natakamani on temple walls, inscriptions, and steles. But unlike most ancient queens whose names merely orbit a male ruler's, Amanitor's is inscribed just as large, just as permanent, just as powerful. Historians debate the exact nature of their relationship with Natakamani, her husband, her son, her co-ruler. The records don't clarify, and maybe that's intentional, because what is clear is that Amanitor was not subordinate. She issued decrees, commissioned architecture, participated in ceremonial rituals reserved only for sovereigns. And she ruled during a golden age. Under Amanitor's leadership, the Kingdom of Kush enjoyed prosperity, trade expansion, and an explosion of construction. Over 200 pyramids exist in Nubia, many of them dating from her era. She and Natakamani rebuilt temples at Napata, Meroe, and other sites. They restored the sacred precincts of Amun. These were not mere vanity projects, they were messages in stone. The queen was here. The queen ruled. Unlike Egypt, where royal women had to masquerade as men to claim full sovereignty, Kushite culture accepted female leadership as a given. The Kandak was a fixture, not an exception. And yet, Amanitor still managed to make her mark louder, deeper, more permanent than most. So what about her personal life? Speculative, fragmented, but unusually open. In Meroitic culture, female rulers were not expected to hide behind veils of chastity or domesticity. The royal line was often passed down matrilineally, meaning queens controlled both the bloodline and the legitimacy. Some sources suggest Amanitor may have had multiple partners, or at least the cultural freedom to do so. In an empire where goddesses were carved with muscular arms and queens sat beside kings, not beneath them, the idea of a sexually autonomous ruler wasn't scandalous. It was expected. There are no salacious stories, no tragic love affairs turned fatal. But there is freedom, the kind that doesn't need explaining. Amanitor's legacy is written not in gossip, but in granite. Today, her name is largely forgotten outside of academic circles. The pyramids she built lie in the shadows of more famous ruins, but in her time, she was formidable, untouchable, revered. She built a kingdom not of lovers, but of laws. Not of seduction, but of symbols. If there were lovers in her life, they stood beside her, not above. And now, from the Nile to the open steppe, we end this journey, where it began, with a queen draped in myth, blood, and contradictions, a woman who ruled like a storm, a warrior whose love story, if it ever existed, was eclipsed by vengeance. Her name still burns in history, not for whom she loved, but for whom she destroyed. Queen Tomiris Massagetai, divided by Central Asia. Tomiris never asked to be remembered. She simply refused to be forgotten. Her name isn't carved into pillars or woven into scripture, but it lives just barely in the cracked pages of Herodotus, that half-historian, half-mythmaker who chronicled the ancient world with a flair for drama and a shaky relationship with evidence. And yet, even through his unreliable lens, Queen Tomiris of the Massagetai emerges with a kind of sharp clarity, a woman whose crown was welded to a sword, whose grief was armor, and whose love, if she had any, was irrelevant to the empire she built. Let's start with the essentials. Tomiris ruled a confederation of nomadic tribes known as the Massagetai, likely located east of the Caspian Sea in the flat, brutal expanse of Central Asia. This was around the 6th century BCE, a time when kingdoms were swallowed whole by empires, and alliances lasted about as long as a battlefield sunrise. The Massagetai were no exception. They were a horse-riding, arrow-slinging, sky-worshipping people, often compared to the Scythians. They didn't build palaces, they built reputations. And Tomiris? She didn't inherit a throne, she defended it. Her reign comes into focus when it intersects with another name, Cyrus the Great, founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Cyrus had already conquered Lydia and Babylon. He had crushed rival kings and reshaped the map. But when he looked east toward the steppes, he saw something else. An opportunity. A woman ruling a land not yet drawn into his empire. He sent her a marriage proposal. You know, the diplomatic kind, the one that comes with armies standing just behind it. Tomiris refused. Cyrus, apparently, didn't handle rejection well. He launched a campaign against the Massagetai. According to Herodotus, he used deception rather than force, leaving wine and feasts behind to lure the Massagetai into a trap. They weren't accustomed to alcohol, and many of her warriors, including her son, Spargapises, were captured or killed in the ensuing ambush. That's where the story stops being military strategy and starts becoming myth. Her son, captured by the Persians, eventually died. Whether by suicide or execution is unclear. What is clear is what Tomiris did next. She gathered her armies, she rode into battle, she met Cyrus head-on, and she won. Herodotus claims she not only defeated the Persian king, but had his corpse found on the battlefield, decapitated, and his severed head shoved into a wineskin filled with blood. "Drink your fill," she allegedly said, "of the blood you thirsted for." Was this true? Probably not. But in the realm of ancient queens, truth is often a function of utility, and this version of Tomiris, ruthless, avenging, victorious, is the one that endured. What's conspicuously absent from her story is romance. Unlike Cleopatra or Theodora or even Zenobia, there are no named lovers, no hinted affairs, no suggestive alliances. Tomiris isn't romanticized. She isn't domesticated. She's never reduced to her relationships. The only love that makes it into the record is maternal, and even that becomes vengeance. But here's where things get interesting. The story of Tomiris survives almost entirely in the words of her enemies. Greek historians, Persian poets, European painters who, centuries later, rendered her holding a bloody sword over Cyrus's corpse with a look of disdain, not triumph. They didn't understand her, so they made her terrifying. And in doing so, they made her eternal. She has been called barbaric, masculine, emotionally unstable. All the usual labels applied to women who choose strategy over softness. But what if she wasn't any of those things? What if she simply understood her world better than the men around her? That in a land where borders meant nothing and survival meant everything, mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford. There's a strange symmetry to how Tomiris ends our parade of queens. She didn't flirt with empire, she bled it. She didn't manipulate kings, she buried them. She didn't wield sexuality, she wielded consequence. And yet, even in her starkness, she fits among the others. Because every queen on this list, from Cleopatra to Liliuokalani, used what the world gave her. Some used beauty, others used belief. Tomiris used a sword. But all of them ruled against expectations, against men, against history itself. So no, she may not have slept with anyone. In fact, she may not have loved anyone at all. But in a world where queens were often forced to trade autonomy for affection, Tomiris made a different deal. She traded nothing, she simply took. And when the dust settled, it was her story blurred, bloody, unfinished, that still stood. Because sometimes the greatest mystery isn't who a queen loved, it's who dared to love her.